The road was barely a road anymore, just a dirt path swallowed by pines, their branches scraping against the sides of my truck like skeletal fingers. The GPS had given up miles back, leaving me with nothing but a crumpled map and a growing sense of unease. The guy at the gas station had warned me about this place. "Ain't nobody been up there in years," he'd said, squinting at me like I was already a dead man. But I didn't listen. Now, as the engine groaned and the headlights flickered over the overgrown trail, I wondered if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. The cabin wasn't on any official maps. My grandfather had mentioned it once. An old hunting shack deep in the woods, left to rot after some tragedy he wouldn't talk about. I hadn't thought much of it until I found his journal in the attic, filled with sketches of the place and coordinates scribbled in the margins. He had circled one page twice, the ink smudged as if his hand had been shaking. "Don't go back," it said, but I had to see it for myself. The trees thinned suddenly, and there it was, a squat, rotting structure hunched in the clearing like a wounded animal. The roof sagged, the porch steps were splintered, and the single window was a black, gaping mouth. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something sour like old meat. I killed the engine. The silence was immediate, pressing in from all sides. No birds, no wind, just the slow creak of the cabin settling. My boots sank into the mud as I stepped out. The ground was soft, too soft, as if something had been digging. I ignored it and moved toward the door, my flashlight cutting a shaky beam through the dark. The wood was warped, the handle rusted shut. I had to shoulder it open, the hinges screaming like something in pain. The inside was worse. Dust hung in the air, swirling in my light. The floorboards groaned under my weight, sagging in places where the rot had taken hold. A table sat overturned, its legs snapped. A rusted stove crouched in the corner, its door hanging open like a broken jaw. And the smell, God, the smell was worse in here. Thick, cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. Something crunched under my boot. I looked down. Bones. Small ones, rabbit, maybe. But then I saw the others. Larger. Too large. My stomach twisted. I swept the light across the floor. More bones. Some old, some fresh, still glistening. And then I saw the marks. Deep grooves in the wood, like something had been dragged. A sound. Outside. A slow, heavy crunch in the leaves. I froze. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my grip. The noise stopped. Then another step. Closer. I wasn't alone. The window was too grimy to see through, but I didn't need to. Something was out there, moving, circling. I backed toward the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps matched mine. 1, 2, a pause. Then faster. I ran. The porch steps splintered under me as I bolted for the truck. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the mud. In the rearview mirror, the cabin shrank, swallowed by the trees. But something moved between them. Tall. Too tall. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. I never told anyone what I saw. No one would believe me anyway. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch that smell again. Wet earth and rotting meat. And I know it's still out there. The cabin wasn't much. Just a small, wooden thing tucked between tall pines, far enough from town that no one would hear a scream. I'd rented it cheap, some old hunting spot listed online, the kind of place you go to when you want silence. No phone signal, no neighbors, just the creak of the wind and the occasional snap of branches underfoot. The first night was fine, cold but fine. The fireplace spat and crackled, throwing shadows against the walls. I slept heavy, the kind of sleep that only comes when the air is thin and the world feels empty. But the second night, things changed. I woke up to a sound. Not an animal, not the wind, something else. A scrape like metal dragging over wood. Slow, deliberate. I lay still, listening. My breath came too fast. The fire had died to embers, leaving the room in near darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. From the front door. I sat up, heart hammering. Maybe it was an animal. A bear, a raccoon, something with claws. But animals don't turn doorknobs. The handle rattled. I didn't move. Couldn't. My muscles locked. My skin prickling with cold sweat. The rattling stopped. For a second, there was nothing. Then, a thud. Shoulder against wood. The door shook in its frame. I scrambled off the bed. My legs tangled in the blanket. The cabin had no back door. Only one window beside the bed, small and square. I yanked it open, the cold air biting my face. Outside, the ground was a 6-foot drop. Another thud. The door groaned. I didn't think, just jumped. My ankle twisted as I hit the dirt, pain shooting up my leg. I stumbled, caught myself on a tree, and ran. The woods were black. Branches whipped my arms, my face. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Behind me, the cabin door burst open. Heavy footsteps crunched over dead leaves. I ran until my lungs burned. The trees thinned, and suddenly I was at the edge of a road. Gravel, barely wide enough for a car. No lights, no houses, just empty darkness. I turned left, limping, my breath ragged. Maybe a mile down, there'd be a town. Maybe someone would be awake. Then I heard it. An engine. A truck rolled into view, headlights cutting through the night. I waved my arms, choking on relief. The truck slowed, then stopped. The window rolled down. The man inside was smiling. It was the same smile I'd seen in the gas station 2 days ago, when I'd stopped to ask for directions. The same man who'd watched me a little too long as I walked back to my car. My stomach dropped. He leaned out the window. Need a ride? I backed up. The woods were behind me, the road ahead. Nowhere to go. The passenger door clicked open. I ran. This time, he didn't follow on foot. The truck's engine roared, tires spitting gravel. I veered off the road, crashing through bushes, thorns tearing at my clothes. The headlights swung, lighting up the trees. Then a fence. Chain link, tall, topped with barbed wire. Beyond it, a yard, a house with lights on. I climbed, the metal shaking under my weight. The truck skidded to a stop behind me. A door slammed. I dropped to the other side, landing hard. The house was 50 feet away. I screamed, pounding on the door. Inside, a dog barked. Curtain moved. The porch light flicked on. The door opened. An old man stood there, shotgun in hand. He took one look at me, bleeding, wild-eyed, then past me to the fence. The truck was gone. The man pulled me inside, locked the door, and called the cops. They found the cabin empty, the door busted open. No prints, no evidence, just my things untouched. The gas station clerk identified the man from my description. A local, a hunter. They never caught him. I moved cities, changed my name, but sometimes, at night, I still hear the scrape of metal on wood, and I know he's still out there, waiting. The road was barely a road anymore, just a narrow strip of dirt cutting through the trees, swallowed by weeds and potholes. My headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, the beams trembling with every bump. The GPS had stopped working an hour ago, and now I was just following the handwritten directions scrawled on a napkin. Left at the fork, past the old mill, keep going until the trees get thicker. I shouldn't have come. The cabin wasn't even mine. It belonged to my uncle, a man I hadn't seen in years. When the lawyer called to say he'd left it to me in his will, I didn't ask why. Maybe I should have. The tires crunched over gravel as I pulled up to the place. It was smaller than I expected. Just a wooden box with a sagging roof, tucked between two massive pines. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar. A bad sign. I killed the engine. The silence was instant, pressing against my ears like a weight. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the faint creak of the cabin settling. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The air smelled damp, like rotting leaves and wet earth. My boots sank into the mud as I walked toward the door. The wood was warped, the handle rusted. I pushed it open. The inside was worse. Dust floated in the flashlight beam, thick enough to taste. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound too loud in the empty space. A couch sat against the far wall, its fabric torn, stuffing leaking out like guts. A single chair was tipped over near the fireplace, as if someone had knocked it down in a hurry. I moved deeper inside, my pulse thudding in my throat. The kitchen was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, a coffee mug shattered on the counter. The fridge door hung open, the inside empty except for a single can of beer, unopened, covered in a layer of mold. Something was wrong here. I turned toward the hallway. 3 doors. One had to be the bedroom. The first door led to a bathroom. The mirror was cracked, the sink stained brown. A towel lay crumpled on the floor, stiff with dried water. The second door was a closet, filled with moth-eaten coats and a single pair of boots, caked in mud. The third door was the bedroom. It was locked. I jiggled the handle. Stuck. I leaned my shoulder into it, shoved hard. The wood splintered, the door flying open with a bang. The smell hit me first sour, metallic. Blood. The beam of my flashlight swept over the bed. The sheets were tangled, stained dark. A hunting knife lay on the pillow, its blade rusted brown. And then I saw the writing, scratched into the wall above the bed, deep gouges in the wood. Don't let him in. My breath caught. The words were fresh, the splinters still pale against the dark wood. Someone had been here recently. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The hallway was empty, but the front door, the one I'd left open, was now closed. I didn't remember closing it. A soft thump came from the living room, then another. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I backed into the bedroom, my hands shaking. The knife. I grabbed it, the handle slick in my grip. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Silence. Then, a long, slow scrape of fingernails against wood. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The scratching continued, moving down the door, lower, lower. Then it stopped. A shadow shifted under the door. Someone was standing there, waiting. The doorknob turned. I lunged, not toward the door, toward the window. I slammed the knife into the glass, shattering it. Cold air rushed in as I climbed through, shards biting into my palms. I hit the ground running, my boots slipping in the mud. I didn't look back. The trees swallowed me whole, branches whipping at my face. I ran until my lungs burned, until the cabin was long gone behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the road, until I saw the glow of headlights in the distance. I never went back. Later, I learned the truth. My uncle hadn't just owned the cabin. He'd been hiding there. From a man. A real one. A neighbor, someone he'd owed money to. The police found his body a month after I left, buried in a shallow grave behind the property. The writing on the wall wasn't for me. It was for him. And that night, in the cabin, he'd finally come to collect. The road had been swallowed by the forest hours ago, leaving only a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my car. Branches scraped against the windows like bony fingers, and the headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. The GPS had stopped working miles back, and my phone had no signal. All I had was a scribbled note with directions to the cabin, my uncle's old hunting retreat, left to me after he died. I didn't want it, but I needed to get away. The city had been choking me. The noise, the people, the constant pressure. A week alone in the woods sounded like the only way to clear my head. Now, as the tires bumped over roots and rocks, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. The cabin finally appeared in the beam of my headlights. It was smaller than I remembered, hunched under the weight of the pines like it was trying to hide. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging in the middle. The front steps were crooked, one of them split down the center. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate, pressing against my ears. No crickets, no wind, just the occasional creak of the trees settling. I grabbed my bag and stepped out. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for early October. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked toward the cabin, my boots crunching on dead leaves. The key was where my uncle said it would be, under a loose floorboard near the door. The wood groaned as I lifted it, the key cold and rusted in my palm. The lock stuck at first, then gave with a metallic screech. The door swung inward, releasing a wave of stale air, damp wood, dust, and something faintly sour underneath. I flicked the light switch. Nothing. Of course, the power had probably been shut off years ago. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. A sagging couch, a wood stove, a table with one broken leg propped up by a stack of old magazines. The kitchenette was tiny, the sink stained brown. A single plate sat on the counter, covered in a thin layer of grime. Upstairs was worse. The bedroom had a mattress, yellowed and sagging, the sheets stiff with age. A dresser leaned against the wall, one drawer hanging open like a slack jaw. The window was grimy, the glass warped, reflecting my flashlight beam back at me in distorted fragments. I dropped my bag on the floor. It would have to do. The first night was bad. I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was branches against the roof, but it was too deliberate, too close, like something was dragging its nails along the outside wall. I lay still, listening. My breath came too fast, my fingers digging into the mattress. The sound moved, slow and steady, circling the cabin. Then it stopped. Silence. I didn't sleep again. Morning didn't bring relief. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the occasional rustle of leaves, like something was moving just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Animals, the wind, but the wind didn't leave footprints. I found them near the edge of the trees, deep, heavy impressions in the mud. Too big to be a deer, too human to be anything else. I followed them. They led in a slow circle around the cabin, then disappeared into the undergrowth. My skin prickled. Someone had been here, last night, watching. I went back inside and locked the door. The second night was worse. I heard breathing, not mine, something else, ragged, wet, right outside the window. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. If I stayed still, maybe it would go away. The breathing stopped. Then, a knock. One single, heavy thud against the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. Another knock, harder this time. The wood groaned under the force. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I knew I wasn't alone. The footprints came back, fresh, closer this time, right up to the porch. I found something else too. A cigarette, but still damp. Someone had been here recently, very recently. I should have left, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. No amount of cursing or kicking the tires changed that. I was trapped. The third night, it got in. I don't know how. The door was locked. The windows were shut. But I woke up to the sound of footsteps downstairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I grabbed the knife from my bag and held my breath. The steps creaked on the stairs. 1, 2, 3. The bedroom door swung open. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. I lunged. The knife sank into his shoulder. He grunted, grabbed my wrist, and twisted. Pain shot up my arm. I kicked, fought, but he was stronger. He dragged me downstairs. I screamed, but no one was around to hear. The last thing I saw before he hit me was the basement door swinging open. Darkness. I woke up in the dark. Cold concrete under me. The smell of damp and rot. My head throbbed. A single light bulb flickered overhead. Chains rattled as I tried to move. My wrists were bound. My ankles too. Across the room, the man sat at a table, sharpening a knife. He looked up, smiled, and then I knew I was never getting out. I never thought a weekend alone in the woods would turn into this. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, old thing tucked deep in the pines, far from the nearest town. I found it through a rental site, cheap and quiet, exactly what I needed. Work had been grinding me down, and the idea of silence, of no emails, no noise, no people sounded perfect. The drive up was long, the roads narrowing from highways to cracked pavement. then to dirt paths winding through the trees. The GPS lost signal about 20 minutes out, but I'd printed the directions just in case. The last stretch was rough, the car bouncing over roots and rocks, branches scraping the sides like fingernails. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than the pictures made it seem. The wood was dark, weathered by years of rain and snow. The porch sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were smudged, reflecting the trees behind me like dull mirrors. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The furniture was sparse. A couch with faded fabric, a wooden table, a bed in the corner. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a battery-powered lamp and a fireplace. Exactly what I wanted. The first night was fine. I lit a fire, ate the food I'd brought, and read until my eyes got heavy. The silence was strange at first, but then it wrapped around me like a blanket. No sirens, no traffic, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Then, on the second night, things changed. I woke up to a sound, something scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a squirrel. I lay still, listening. The scratching came again, slow and deliberate, like something was dragging its claws down the wood. I sat up, my heart thumping. The fire had died to embers, leaving the cabin dark except for the faint glow. The scratching stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then *thump star. Something hit the door. Not hard, but enough to make the wood shudder. I stood, my legs unsteady. The cabin was cold now, the warmth from the fire long gone. I grabbed the lamp, clicking it on. The yellow light spilled across the floor, making shadows jump. Silence. I took a step toward the door. My breath came fast, my fingers tight around the lamp. Another step. The floorboards groaned under my weight. Then *thump star. 2 knocks. Not random, not an animal. Someone was out there. I froze. My mind raced. No one knew I was here. The rental guy lived hours away. The nearest town was a 30-minute drive. There were no neighbors, no hikers, nothing. Thump, thump, thump. Louder now. Insistent. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. The lamp shook in my hand, the light flickering. Then a voice, a low, rasping whisper, right against the door. *, let me in. *. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't speak. The voice didn't sound right. Too rough, too broken, like the person had been screaming for hours. I know you're in there. I looked around for a weapon. The fireplace poker was still by the hearth. I grabbed it, the metal cold in my grip. The doorknob rattled. I held my breath. The lock was old, flimsy. If they really wanted in, they could break it. Then silence. No scratching, no knocking, no voice. I waited, my muscles tense. A minute passed, then another. Had they left? I crept closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. Then bang. Something slammed against the door, hard enough to make the frame shake. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the poker. Open it. The scream was raw, furious. I turned and ran for the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. There was no lock, so I dragged the dresser in front of it, my arms shaking. The pounding started again, louder now, like they were throwing their whole weight against the door. The cabin walls trembled. I fumbled for my phone. No signal. Of course. The pounding stopped. I waited, my back pressed against the dresser. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. Then a new sound. Scratching. But not at the front door. At the window. I turned slowly. The bedroom window was small, covered by a thin curtain. The scratching moved along the glass, slow, deliberate. Then a shadow passed by. Tall. Too tall. I gripped the poker tighter. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then *tap star. Fingertips against the glass. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The curtain moved. Just a little. Like someone was trying to peel it back. I lunged forward and yanked it shut. A hand slammed against the glass. Pale, fingers splayed. I screamed. The hand pulled away. Silence again. I stayed there, frozen, listening. Then footsteps, moving around the cabin. Slow, heavy. They were circling. I looked around the room. The window was the only way in besides the door. If they got through, I was trapped. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing. I waited. Minutes passed. The cabin stayed quiet. Had they left? I didn't trust it. I stayed pressed against the dresser, the poker in my lap, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. Only then did I move. I pushed the dresser aside and opened the door. The cabin was empty, the front door still shut. I stepped closer, peering out the window. Nothing. No one. The ground outside was muddy from last night's rain. And there, right in front of the door, were footprints, leading away into the trees. I packed my things in a hurry, my hands shaking. The car started on the first try, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road. I never found out who or what was out there that night, but I never went back to the cabin again. The trees press in from all sides, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The cabin sits in the middle of it all, old and rotting, its wood blackened by years of rain and neglect. I found the key under a moss-covered rock, just like the note said. The metal is cold in my hand, rusted but still solid. It fits into the lock with a grinding screech, and the door swings open with a groan. The air inside is thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something sour like old meat. The floorboards creak under my boots, each step sending a shudder through the cabin. The windows are grimy, barely letting in any light, but I can see enough to know I'm not alone. There are marks on the walls, deep scratches, like something was dragged across them. The fireplace is full of ashes, but not from wood. Bits of charred bones stick out from the pile, white against the black. My stomach twists. I shouldn't be here. I tell myself it's just an old hunting cabin, that the bones are from deer or some other animal. But then I see the mattress in the corner. It's stained dark in the middle, the fabric stiff and crusted. Flies buzz around it, landing and taking off in lazy circles. A sound comes from outside, a snapping branch. I freeze. The forest is too quiet. No birds, no wind, just that one sharp crack. Then another. Something's moving out there. I back away from the door, my heart hammering. The window gives me a sliver of a view. First, I see nothing. Then movement, a shadow shifting between the trees. Not an animal. Too tall, too slow. The doorknob rattles. I don't wait to see who or what is on the other side. I bolt for the back door, shoving it open just as the front one bursts inward. The cold air hits my face as I sprint into the trees, branches whipping at my arms. Behind me, footsteps, heavy, fast. I don't look back. I run until my lungs burn, until the cabin is far behind me. Only then do I stop, gasping, my hands shaking. I won't be coming back here, ever. But I know one thing for sure, whoever owns that cabin isn't done with me, and they know where I live. The road had been bad from the start. Narrow, winding, swallowed up by trees so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the paper map I'd brought was useless in the dark. The car's headlights cut through the blackness, but not far enough. Every turn felt like a mistake. Then I saw the cabin. It wasn't on any map, just a squat, wooden thing hunched between the pines, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were dark, the porch steps rotten, but the engine had been sputtering for miles, and the storm was coming fast. I didn't have a choice. I killed the engine and sat there, listening to the wind push through the trees. The air smelled like wet earth and something else, something sharp, like rust. My hands were still on the wheel, fingers stiff from gripping too tight. I forced myself to move. The cabin door groaned when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stale scent of old wood smoke. The floorboards creaked under my boots, loud in the silence. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. A table, a chair, a fireplace filled with cold ashes. Nothing looked like it had been touched in years. I dropped my bag on the table and checked my phone. No signal, just like before. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes. Rain started tapping against the roof, slow at first, then heavier. That's when I heard it. A scratch. Soft but unmistakable, like nails dragging over wood. It came from the far wall, near the bedroom door. I froze, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. Just the wind. But the sound came again. Closer. My breath hitched. I took a step back, my boot catching on a loose floorboard. The noise stopped. For a second, there was nothing but the rain and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then asterisk thump star. Something heavy hit the floor inside the bedroom. I ran out the door into the storm. The rain lashed at my face, cold and sharp. I didn't look back. The car door stuck when I yanked it, my hands slick with rain and sweat. The engine coughed, sputtered, and turned over. I slammed the gas, tires spinning in the mud before catching. The cabin shrank in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. Later, at a gas station 50 miles away, I saw the scratches on my bag. Deep grooves, like something had tried to claw its way out. The road had been bad from the start. Narrow, winding, swallowed up by trees so thick the headlights barely cut through. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and now I was just following a dirt path that seemed to get worse with every mile. The car groaned beneath me, tires slipping on wet leaves, the engine struggling against the steep incline. Rain hammered the roof, loud enough to drown out the radio, and the wind shook the trees like something was moving through them. I checked the map again, even though I knew it was useless. The paper was damp from my hands, the ink smudged where my thumb had rubbed against it. The cabin was supposed to be here, a rental, cheap and secluded, perfect for a week of silence. No neighbors, no noise, just me and the woods. But now, with the storm getting worse and the night pressing in, it didn't feel perfect. Felt like a mistake. Finally, the headlights caught something. A wooden sign, half-rotted, nailed to a tree. Black Pine Cabin 1 mile. The letters were faded, barely visible under layers of moss and grime. I exhaled, relief mixing with unease. At least I was close. The road turned to mud, the wheels spinning before catching traction. Branches scraped against the sides of the car, fingernails on metal. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. And then there it was. The cabin looked smaller than in the photos. Older. The wood was dark with age, the porch sagging under the weight of years. One of the windows was boarded up, the glass long gone. The front door hung slightly open, swaying in the wind. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, staring at the place. It wasn't right. The rental listing had shown a cozy little retreat, freshly painted, with a stone chimney and a clean interior. This was none of that. This was something else. But the storm was getting worse, and I had nowhere else to go. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me instantly, water soaking through my jacket, my shoes sinking into the mud. The wind howled through the trees, branches creaking like old bones. I hurried up the steps, the wood groaning under my weight, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, mildew, something faintly sour underneath. The air was thick, stale, like the place had been shut up for years. I fumbled for the light switch, flicking it up and down. Nothing. Power was out. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a single room with a kitchenette, a worn-out couch, and a wood stove in the corner. Dust coated everything, swirling in the light. The floorboards creaked as I stepped inside, the sound too loud in the silence. Something was wrong here. I told myself it was just the storm, the unfamiliar place, the dark. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The cabin didn't feel empty, felt like it was waiting. I set my bag down on the table, the wood sticky under my fingers. The rental listing had mentioned supplies, firewood, matches, canned food. I needed to find them before the phone died. I moved toward the kitchen, the floor groaning with every step. The cabinets were empty except for a single can of beans, rusted at the edges. No matches, no firewood. A noise from outside made me freeze. Not the wind, not the rain, something else. A thump, like something heavy hitting the porch. I held my breath, listening. The storm raged on, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe it was nothing. I forced myself to move, to check the rest of the cabin. There was a door at the back, a bedroom probably. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges whining. The room was small, just a bed and a dresser. The mattress was bare, stained in places, the smell worse in here. And then I saw it. Footprints. Muddy, fresh, leading from the window to the bed. Someone had been here. Recently. My pulse pounded in my ears. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. The front door was still open. Rain blowing in. I hadn't closed it. Had I? Another sound. A scrape. Like something dragging across the porch. I turned off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the cabin. I wasn't alone. The road was supposed to save me time. Just a thin, winding strip of asphalt cutting through the black pines. A dense forest that swallowed sound and light whole. My GPS had flickered out an hour ago, leaving me with nothing but the dim glow of my headlights and the creeping suspicion that I was lost. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches clawing at the roof of my car like skeletal fingers. I told myself it was just the wind. The first sign that something was wrong came when the engine sputtered. A rough, choking sound, like the car was gasping for air. The dashboard lights flickered, then died. The wheel went stiff in my hands. I barely managed to steer onto the shoulder before the car gave one final shudder and fell silent. Dead. I sat there for a long time, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the distant rustle of the woods. No cell service, no other cars, just me and the endless dark. That's when I saw it, a cabin. It wasn't much, just a squat little thing tucked between the trees, its roof sagging under years of neglect. A single window, clouded with grime, reflected the weak moonlight. The front door hung slightly open, swaying on rusted hinges. I shouldn't have gone inside, but the cold was biting, and the thought of spending the night in a dead car was worse than whatever waited in that cabin. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Old blood, maybe, or rust. The walls were bare except for a single yellowed calendar from 1987. Someone had crossed out the days in red marker over and over until the ink bled through the paper. I told myself it was just some hunter's old shelter. Then I saw the chair. It sat in the middle of the room, its wooden legs scarred with deep, jagged grooves. The ropes tied to the arms were frayed, the fibers stiff with dried sweat. And beneath it, a dark stain, spreading across the floorboards like a shadow. My breath hitched. That's when I heard it, the creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned slowly. The door was closed. I hadn't closed it. The silence was suffocating. No wind, no animals, just the slow, steady drip of something wet hitting the floor. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. The cold air burned my lungs as I crashed through the trees, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, something moved, something fast. Not an animal, not anything natural. The sound of heavy footsteps pounded against the earth, gaining on me. I didn't look back. The road appeared like a mirage, the asphalt gleaming under the moonlight. I didn't stop running until my knees gave out, until the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking, but when I finally turned around, the woods were still. No cabin, no footsteps, just the black pines watching, waiting. I never took that shortcut again. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, wooden thing tucked deep in the Oregon forest, miles from the nearest town. My uncle owned it, said it was peaceful, a good place to clear your head. I needed that. Life had been a mess lately, work, bills, the kind of stress that sticks to your bones. So I packed a bag, filled the trunk with enough food and water for 3 days, and drove out there. The first night was fine, quiet, the kind of quiet you only get when there's nothing around for miles. No cars, no people, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I built a fire in the old stone fireplace, ate canned beans straight from the pot, and fell asleep on the lumpy couch under a thick wool blanket. It was the second night when things changed. I woke up to a sound. Not an animal, not the wind. Something else. A scrape like wood dragging against wood. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows across the room. The sound came again, closer this time. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering. The cabin had one door, one window. Both were locked. I had checked before bed. But the noise was inside, not outside, inside. My fingers closed around the hunting knife I kept on the coffee table. The blade was cold against my palm. I stood, stepping carefully, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. The sound had stopped, but the air felt wrong, thick, like something was waiting. Then I saw it. The floor in the corner of the room was slightly raised. Just a little, like something was pushing up from beneath. I stared, my breath coming too fast. The wood groaned, then shifted. A hand, pale, dirt-streaked, slid out from under the floor. I didn't scream. I didn't move. My body locked up, every muscle tight with fear. The fingers curled, nails digging into the wood. Then another hand. Then a head, messy dark hair. A face streaked with mud and something darker. Blood. A man. Not a ghost. Not some monster from a story. A real man crawling out from under the cabin. He pulled himself up, his clothes torn, his breathing ragged. He didn't see me at first. He was too busy dragging himself free, his legs tangled in something, roots maybe or old wiring. Then he turned. Our eyes met. His were wild, bloodshot. He bared his teeth. Not a smile, not a snarl, just a grimace of pain or madness. He lunged. I swung the knife. The blade caught him in the shoulder. He howled, stumbling back, but he didn't go down. He came at me again, hands grabbing, fingers clawing at my arms. I kicked, twisted, slashed blindly. The knife bit into flesh again. Hot blood sprayed across my face. He fell. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I ran. The door crashed open, cold night air hitting me like a slap. I sprinted for the car, keys already in my hand. Behind me, I heard him grunting, cursing, crashing through the cabin door after me. The engine roared to life just as he reached the driver's side window. His fist smashed against the glass once, twice. Cracks spiderwebbed across it. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel. He clung to the door handle, his face pressed against the window, screaming something I couldn't hear over the engine. Then I hit the gas. The car lurched backward, fishtailing on the dirt road. He lost his grip, tumbling into the darkness. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just drove, my hands shaking on the wheel, blood dripping from the knife still clutched in my fist. It took an hour to reach the nearest town. The sheriff listened, his face grim. They found the man the next day, half dead, hiding in a drainage ditch a mile from the cabin. Turns out he was a fugitive wanted for 2 murders up north. He'd been hiding under the cabin for days, waiting. I never went back. Sold the place, left the state. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear that sound, wood scraping against wood. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. I had always been the type to enjoy a quiet retreat, a break from the chaos of the city, the noise, the endless distractions. So when a friend suggested a cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan, I was eager to leave it all behind. The idea of being completely isolated, far from civilization, sounded like the perfect escape. I booked the cabin without a second thought. The drive up was long, winding, and uneventful. The further I drove, the more the scenery changed. The forest grew denser, the roads rougher. I passed by small towns, their structures slowly becoming fewer and further apart, replaced by sprawling woods that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a muted orange glow over the land. The air was thick with the smell of pine, fresh and slightly damp. The cabin was exactly as described in the listing: rustic, old, but sturdy looking. It had a steep pitched roof, wooden walls, and a large stone fireplace. The porch was a bit run down, the paint chipped from years of neglect, but it had a charm to it. I couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what I needed. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call were the only things breaking the silence. Felt peaceful. After unloading my car, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest stretched out in all directions, and the thought of being so far removed from everything made my heart race with excitement. I wandered down a small trail that led away from the cabin, the earth soft beneath my boots. The trees were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching high into the sky like twisted arms. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The trail meandered for a while, and I noticed something strange. There were no animals, not even squirrels or birds, just silence. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself that it was normal. The air was thick with the scent of earth and pine needles, and the cool breeze felt good on my skin. As I walked deeper into the woods, I stumbled upon an old clearing. The ground was uneven, and the grass had grown wild, as if no one had set foot here in years. At the center of the clearing was a small, dilapidated stone structure. It looked like an old well, overgrown with ivy and moss. My curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it. The stones were weathered, and the opening was filled with water, its surface still and dark, reflecting the trees above. I stood there for a while, staring at the well, a strange unease creeping up my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to touch it. The stone was cold under my fingers, and as soon as I did, a gust of wind rushed through the trees, shaking the leaves violently. I froze, a sense of dread washing over me. Something wasn't right. The feeling in my chest grew heavier, like a weight pressing against my ribs. I left the clearing quickly, trying to shake off the strange sensation. The rest of the evening passed quietly. I made a simple dinner and settled in front of the fireplace with a book. The house felt warm and cozy, but the silence outside was unnerving. It was a quiet that felt unnatural, not peaceful but oppressive. My mind kept wandering back to the well in the clearing, the way it seemed to call to me, beckoning me to come closer. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, the soft crackling of the fire in the next room my only comfort. Every small sound in the cabin seemed amplified in the silence. I heard the creaking of the wooden floors, the soft whistle of the wind outside, and then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, something else. A sound from the woods, a low, soft thud, like something heavy falling. It was distant, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound didn't repeat, but the tension in the air remained. I rolled over, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. The wind, an animal, maybe even the branches of a tree snapping in the distance. But something about it felt wrong. The next morning, I woke up late, groggy from a restless night. The sun had already risen, and the light that filtered through the trees outside painted the cabin in soft hues of gold. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch, taking in the crisp morning air. The forest was still, but now the quiet felt more natural, more like the calm of a fresh morning than the oppressive stillness of the night before. I decided to venture back to the clearing. The strange feeling from last night still lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the need to understand what had happened. I retraced my steps, the forest now alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, the soft crunch of twigs beneath my boots. As I reached the clearing, I noticed something strange. The well was different. The ivy that had once covered it so thickly had been torn away, revealing the stones more clearly. The water in the well was lower than before, as if something had been drinking from it. But I couldn't understand how that could be. No one had been here, not for years, not since the well had been abandoned. I knelt by the edge of the well, my heart pounding in my chest as I peered into the dark water. It was deeper than I had realized. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the well, just barely visible, was something that didn't belong. A glint of metal. I hesitated for a moment, trying to reason with myself. It was just some old junk, probably a tool that had fallen in long ago. But my gut told me otherwise. There was something more to this well. I stood up abruptly, my decision made. I was going to leave. No more curiosity, no more wandering. This place, something was off about it. I turned to walk away, but as I did, I heard it again. That sound. The thud. This time it was closer, much closer, and it was followed by a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the forest floor. I froze, heart in my throat, my mind racing to make sense of it. The noise was coming from behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. I slowly turned around, trying not to make a sound. The trees were thick, their shadows casting dark pools on the forest floor. I couldn't see anything at first, but then I caught a glimpse of movement, a shape darting between the trees, low to the ground. It wasn't an animal. It was too fast, too purposeful. My stomach dropped. I had to leave. I ran back to the cabin, my breath ragged, my legs aching with each step. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin, once cozy and inviting, now felt like a prison. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, and the silence of the woods returned. But it was no longer peaceful. It was threatening. I didn't know what I had seen in the forest or what was lurking out there, but I was done. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard the sounds again. The thuds, the dragging. They were close, too close, and this time they didn't stop. I thought about the well, the glint of metal at the bottom, and I realized something. Whatever was out there wasn't interested in me leaving. It wanted something more. I spent the rest of the night awake, every sound sending me into a panic. By dawn, I packed my things and left the cabin. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the woods, the cabin now a small on the horizon. I never went back, and as far as I know, no one has since. The cabin still stands, deep in those woods, but no one speaks about it. And sometimes, when I think back to that night, I still hear the scraping, the dragging, just beyond the trees. The road was supposed to save me time. Just a narrow, winding path through the woods, barely wide enough for my truck. The GPS had flickered out about 20 minutes back, leaving me with nothing but the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. The air smelled damp, like rotting leaves and wet earth. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles white. The clock on the dashboard read 11:37 p.m. I was supposed to be at my brother's place by now, but the storm had rolled in fast, turning the roads to sludge. Rain hammered down in thick sheets, blurring the windshield no matter how fast the wipers worked. Then I saw it, a cabin. It stood just off the road, half hidden by the trees. Old, wooden, the kind of place that looked like it had been forgotten for decades. The roof sagged in the middle and the windows were dark, gaping holes. The front porch was littered with broken boards, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I shouldn't have stopped, but my gas was low, and the storm wasn't letting up. The idea of sleeping in the truck made my back ache just thinking about it. Maybe the cabin was abandoned. Maybe I could wait out the worst of the rain. I pulled over, the tires sinking into the mud. The engine sputtered as I turned it off, leaving me in silence except for the pounding rain. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The cold hit me immediately, seeping through my jacket. The cabin loomed ahead, looking even worse up close. The wood was blackened in places, like it had been scorched by fire long ago. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed onto the porch. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and something else, something sour, hitting me hard. Inside was worse. The floor was littered with debris, broken bottles, shredded fabric, animal droppings. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the pattern long faded. A rusted stove sat in the corner, its pipe hanging loose. The air was thick with dust, swirling in my flashlight's beam. I stepped further in, my pulse quickening. Something felt off. Not supernatural, not like in those stupid horror movies. This was worse, this was real. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone. Then I saw the blood. A dark stain spread across the floorboards near the fireplace. Not fresh, but not old enough to have faded completely. My stomach twisted. Someone had been hurt here. Recently. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Not the wind, not the rain. A slow, deliberate step. I froze. My breath came too fast, my chest tight. The beam of my flashlight shook as I aimed it toward the staircase. The steps were sagging, the banister broken. But there, at the top, a shadow moved. Not an animal. Too big. Too human. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door, my boots slipping on the wet wood. Behind me, footsteps pounded down the stairs. Fast. Heavy. I didn't look back. The rain hit me like a wall as I burst outside, sprinting for my truck. My keys were still in my pocket. I fumbled with them, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life just as the figure emerged from the cabin. Tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden in the dark. He didn't run, just stood there watching. I slammed the gas, tires spinning in the mud before finally catching. The truck lurched forward, fishtailing as I swerved back onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the cabin disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop driving until I saw streetlights. The police found the place 2 days later. They didn't tell me much, just that it had been used by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A fugitive. Killer. I still dream about that cabin. About the way the floor creaked under his weight. About the way he watched me leave, like he knew I'd be back. But I won't. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. A simple cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, far from the hustle of daily life. Just me, Leah, and my younger brother, Tom. We didn't need anything fancy, just a quiet place to relax, disconnect from the world, and clear our heads. The cabin was old, sure, but that was part of the charm. Rustic, comfortable, simple. It was a late Friday afternoon when we arrived, the sun dipping low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt road leading up to the cabin. The air had that crisp, fresh quality, the kind that reminds you of autumn even when it's still technically summer. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as we unloaded the car. Tom had already darted off to explore the surrounding woods, eager to stretch his legs after the long drive. I was already starting to feel the peace I'd been hoping for, but I knew it wouldn't last. Inside, the cabin was cozy in a way that only an old house could be. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were lined with weathered pine paneling. A stone fireplace dominated one corner of the living room, and there was a smell of something faintly musty in the air, like old books or wool blankets. The furniture was sparse but functional. A couple of mismatched chairs, faded couch, a wooden table in the center, scuffed and scratched from years of use. The windows were large, letting in plenty of natural light during the day. But now, as night fell, they only served to highlight how empty and isolated the place felt. Tom had already made himself comfortable on the old porch swing, rocking back and forth with his feet kicked up. I called out to him, asking if he wanted to help set up the fire pit out back. He gave me a half-hearted thumbs up without even looking in my direction. It was the first real sign of him being detached. I wasn't worried, though. Tom had always been like that, independent, solitary. At 15, he preferred the outdoors over anything else, and I knew he'd be fine, even if I was left to handle the setup alone. I set to work preparing the fire pit. It didn't take much. Gathering logs and kindling, striking matches until the fire crackled to life. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows against the trees that bordered the clearing. The woods around the cabin were dense, the trees thick and unyielding, blocking out most of the sky. It felt like the cabin sat in a hollow, isolated from the world. As the fire warmed the air, I noticed a strange stillness in the woods. The birds had gone silent, and even the usual rustling of animals in the underbrush had ceased. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as just my nerves catching up with me. Tom didn't seem to notice. He'd wandered off deeper into the woods, no doubt searching for some kind of adventure. I could barely make him out through the thick trees. When it got dark enough, I headed inside to get some dinner started. The kitchen was simple, nothing fancy, just a stove, a small fridge, and an old wooden table. I wasn't in the mood to cook something complicated, so I tossed a couple of frozen pizzas in the oven and cracked open a beer. The warmth from the oven mixed with the cool evening air, and I sank into the chair by the window, waiting for the food to cook. The silence outside had deepened, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The wind had picked up, too, rustling the trees in the distance, but even that sound seemed muted, distant. I stared out at the darkening woods, my mind wandering. It wasn't until I heard the first thud that I realized something wasn't right. It was a soft noise, just a dull thump that echoed through the quiet. I froze, straining my ears. Nothing. The wind? A tree branch falling? But then it came again. A louder thud, followed by another. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It was too rhythmic to be random. The thuds came in intervals, almost like footsteps. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door and stepped outside, heart pounding. The air felt different now, heavier, colder. My breath hung in the air like a fog as I walked toward the woods, the beam of light cutting through the darkness in front of me. Each step felt deliberate, like something or someone was watching me. I didn't call for Tom. Maybe I should have, but I had this overwhelming sense that calling out would make it worse, like it would draw whatever was out there closer. Another thud, louder now, came from deeper in the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. My skin prickled as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't move for a moment, too terrified to make a sound. I stood there, frozen, in the dim glow of the flashlight, trying to make sense of it all. Then, a rustling noise broke through the silence. Something or someone was moving in the underbrush, and whatever it was close. I felt my chest tighten with fear, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of whatever was out there. It wasn't until the faintest glimmer of movement caught my eye that I saw it. In the far distance, just on the edge of the tree line, I saw the unmistakable silhouette of a person, tall but hunched over, like they were stalking something or trying to stay hidden. They didn't move in any way that felt natural. There was no casual walk, no quick movement. It was slow, deliberate, like they were waiting for something, watching me. I ran inside and slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked every window, every door, and then I grabbed the kitchen knife, clutching it tightly in my hand. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open, for whatever was out there to come inside. Tom still wasn't back. I tried calling him, but there was no answer. I left a message, telling him to come back immediately. The seconds felt like hours. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What was that figure in the woods? Why was it there? The night dragged on, and I stayed up, too terrified to sleep. The sounds from the woods stopped for a while, but the silence only made everything worse. It was like I was waiting for something to happen, but I didn't know what. Then, just as I was starting to think it was over, the sound started again. Thud, thud, drag. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait. I couldn't let Tom get caught out there alone. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my shoes, and headed back outside. The cold air slapped me in the face as I stepped out onto the porch, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I moved toward the woods, but the closer I got to the trees, the more the ground seemed to shift beneath me. It was as if the earth itself was unsettled, like something deep in the forest was calling to me. My breath came in ragged gasps, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I pushed through the thick underbrush. It was then that I saw him, Tom, lying motionless on the ground, face down in the dirt. His backpack was scattered nearby, its contents spilling out. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to him, shaking him gently. "Tom," I whispered urgently, but he didn't stir. His skin was cold, his body unnaturally stiff. I shook him harder, panic flooding my veins. He groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked disoriented, like he didn't know where he was. "What happened?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. Tom groaned again, sitting up slowly. He was trembling, his clothes covered in dirt, leaves, and something darker, something that looked like blood. "I don't know," he said in a low voice. I was walking, and then it was like something was following me. I didn't know where I was. I couldn't find my way back. It was like the woods were moving. I couldn't get out. I helped him to his feet, keeping my eyes on the trees, watching for any movement. My heart was still racing, but there was no sound, no sign of whatever had been stalking us. "Let's go back to the cabin," I said, my voice shaking. We didn't look back as we walked quickly through the woods, back toward the safety of the cabin. As we reached the clearing, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The woods were silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was still watching us, waiting for the next chance to strike. But for the moment, at least we were safe. I locked the door behind us, double-checking that everything was secure. Tom sat down on the couch, still visibly shaken, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak for a long time, but I could tell that he, too, felt the same unease that had settled over the cabin. It wasn't until morning came that the terror of the previous night began to fade. But I knew one thing for sure. We weren't alone in those woods. Whatever had been out there was still there, waiting, and we weren't going to be safe until we left. I never wanted to spend a night in that cabin. It wasn't some dramatic feeling of doom or a gut instinct telling me to run. Just a simple, gnawing discomfort that I brushed off as nerves. The place was old, nestled deep in the main woods, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. My friend Daniel had found it online, some old family property he had managed to rent dirt cheap. He talked about it like it was a hidden gem, an untouched retreat from the modern world. No cell service, no electricity, no running water. Completely off-grid, he had said, like it was some badge of honor. The plan was simple: 4 days, 3 nights. Just me, Daniel, and our other friend Mark. We packed enough supplies to last a week, just in case. We drove out there in Mark's truck, following GPS until it gave up, then relying on an old, hand-drawn map Daniel had gotten from the property owner. The drive itself should have been a warning. Narrow dirt roads barely wide enough for the truck, thick trees pressing in from both sides, and an unsettling silence that settled over everything the farther we went. The cabin itself was worse than I expected. It was a squat, single-story building with a sagging roof and a front porch that looked like it might collapse under our weight. The windows were small, covered in grime, and the whole place smelled like damp wood and something else I couldn't place at first. We unloaded our gear, set up sleeping bags on the floor, and built a fire in the old stone fireplace. Inside, the cabin was even smaller than it looked from outside. One main room, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom that was just an outhouse out back. That first night, everything seemed fine. We cooked on a portable stove, drank a few beers, and listened to the wind outside. But even then, something felt off. The quiet wasn't normal. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you expect in the middle of nowhere. It was heavy, unnatural. Even the trees outside barely moved despite the wind. Every sound we made seemed swallowed up, like the forest itself didn't want to acknowledge we were there. The second day, we explored. The property extended for acres, mostly thick forest with narrow game trails winding through. We hiked out past an old, rusted-out truck left to rot in a clearing. No one knew how long it had been there. The thing was gutted, the doors missing, the seats torn apart like animals had nested inside. I remember running my hand along the hood, feeling how the metal had warped and bubbled from decades of weather. It didn't look like it had been abandoned. It looked like someone had driven it out there and just left. That night, I woke up to something moving outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I heard the sound again. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just listened as whoever or whatever was out there kept pacing. The footsteps would stop, then start again. I wanted to wake the others, but I was too afraid to move, afraid that whoever was out there would hear me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. In the morning, I didn't mention it. Maybe I should have. Maybe that would have changed things. But I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The tracks in the dirt outside told a different story. They were deep, clear boot prints, not animal tracks. Someone had been out there. Daniel and Mark shrugged it off. Probably just some hunter passing through, Daniel said. People come out here all the time. Maybe, but why would a hunter be walking circles around our cabin in the middle of the night? That third day, I felt the unease settle into my bones. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. Every shadow stretched too long, too dark. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just at the edge of the trees, watching. That night, it happened again. The footsteps, the slow, measured steps moving around the cabin. This time, I woke Mark and Daniel. We sat there, huddled in the dark, listening. Daniel grabbed the hatchet we had brought for firewood. Mark had a flashlight, but none of us wanted to turn it on. Whoever was out there, we didn't want them knowing we were awake. Then the sound changed. Instead of circling, the footsteps stopped right outside the front door. A long, heavy silence followed. Then the doorknob rattled. I don't remember breathing. I don't even remember thinking. I just sat there, frozen, as whoever was out there tested the door. It was locked, but it was an old lock, the kind you could probably force open if you tried hard enough. But they didn't. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. We didn't sleep after that. We sat there, waiting, listening, but the sound never came back. At first light, we packed everything, shoved it into the truck, and left without saying a word. Daniel tried to laugh it off. Just some weirdo messing with us, he said. But he didn't believe it. None of us did. Mark was quiet the whole drive back. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching us leave. We never found out who it was. Maybe just a local messing with outsiders. Maybe something worse. But I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Not because I was scared or anything, but because it felt unnecessary. I had work to do, things to handle. But my brother, Jake, had been on my case about it for weeks. You need a break, man. Just a weekend. No cell service, no stress. It sounded good. Sure, but something about being cut off in the middle of nowhere made my stomach feel heavy. Still, I let him talk me into it. The drive up was long. The cabin was in northern Minnesota, a good 4-hour drive from the city. I left on a Friday afternoon, packed light, just the essentials. Food, extra clothes, my hunting rifle, Jake insisted, and a couple of books I knew I wouldn't read. The road stretched ahead, twisting through dense forests, the trees pressing in closer the farther I went. The last 20 miles were nothing but a narrow dirt path, my truck kicking up dust as I rolled over deep ruts and loose gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking. It sat in a clearing, a single-story log structure with a metal roof that looked like it had been there for decades. The porch sagged a little and the windows were small and dark. Jake had said the place belonged to a friend of a friend, some guy who only used it for hunting in the fall. Felt abandoned, but it wasn't in bad shape. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly musty. The furniture was simple. Wooden chairs, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, a stone fireplace along the back wall. The kitchen was small, just a stove and a sink, a single counter with a few cabinets above. I dropped my bag near the door and went through the place, checking each room out of habit. 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, nothing unusual. The windows were all shut, the back door locked. The silence in there felt thick, heavy. I told myself I was just tired. I spent the first night reading, drinking a couple of beers, and trying to enjoy the solitude. The wind moved through the trees outside, making them creak and groan. Now and then, something rustled in the woods, but that was normal. Probably deer, maybe a raccoon. I wasn't worried. At some point, I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up to a noise, a dull, rhythmic thumping. I sat up, disoriented. The room was dark, the fire barely glowing. My neck ached from the way I had been laying. The sound came again. Thump, thump, thump. I frowned, listening. It wasn't inside the cabin. It was coming from outside, from the woods. I stood up, my heart already beating a little too fast. I moved to the nearest window and peered out. The trees stood still, dark shapes against the night. Nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place. I waited, holding my breath. Silence. After a minute, I exhaled and shook my head. Probably a branch falling somewhere, maybe an animal knocking against something. I turned away, went to grab another beer from the kitchen. Thump. It was closer. I froze. The sound was deep, almost hollow. Steady. Deliberate. My hands clenched involuntarily. I looked toward the front door. A part of me wanted to open it, to step outside and check. Another part told me not to be an idiot. Instead, I locked the door, checked it twice. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning was quiet. Too quiet. I went outside, stretching, feeling ridiculous about the night before. The air was crisp, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. I walked around the cabin, looking for anything that might explain the noise. Nothing. No footprints, no fallen branches, nothing disturbed. Just the endless trees, towering and still. I spent the day trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I went on a short hike, brought the rifle just in case, but didn't see much besides squirrels and a couple of deer in the distance. The woods felt normal, but I still couldn't relax. That night, I made sure the fire was going strong before I tried to sleep. I locked every door, every window. The rifle sat next to me. I still woke up to the sound. Thump, thump, thump. Closer. I sat up, pulse hammering. My mouth was dry. The sound wasn't coming from the woods this time. It was coming from the porch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fire had burned low again, shadows stretching across the room. The thumping was slow, steady. Someone was out there. I reached for the rifle, gripping it tightly, trying to think. The truck keys were on the counter. I could make a run for it, but what if they were waiting for me to step outside? The thumping stopped. Silence, heavy and absolute. Then, the doorknob rattled. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They twisted the knob once, twice, testing it. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door even though I couldn't see anything. My finger hovered over the trigger. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. I didn't move. My arms ached from holding the gun so tight. Then, finally, the wind picked up outside. The trees swayed, creaking in the dark. I stayed like that, staring at the door, until the first light of morning pushed through the windows. When I finally got the courage to open the door, the porch was empty. The woods stood still. Nothing was out of place. But when I stepped forward, my boot hit something. A single boot print. Not mine. Fresh. Too fresh. I packed my things and left. Drove without stopping, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Didn't think. Didn't breathe right until I saw the highway. Jake called me later, asked how the trip was. Fine, I said. I never went back. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a break from the constant noise of the city and the pressure of work. I'd never been one for hiking or the outdoors, but when my cousin Jesse suggested we rent a small cabin up in the mountains, I figured it'd be a good change of pace. Maybe I'd even do some reading by the fire, drink some hot chocolate, and relax for a couple of days. We left early that Friday morning, the air crisp and cool as we drove deeper into the mountains. The trees became thicker the higher we climbed, the roads more winding and narrow. I glanced over at Jesse as we passed small signs pointing to hiking trails and campsites. He was the outdoorsy type, always talking about his latest adventure or gear. I, on the other hand, was more of a stay inside and binge watch TV kind of person, but I was up for the experience. The cabin was situated at the edge of a forest, surrounded by dense trees on 3 sides. It looked old, but sturdy, built of dark wood that almost blended in with the surrounding landscape. There was a small creek running behind it, its soft gurgling the only sound that greeted us as we pulled up. The place seemed remote, almost too remote, but Jesse was eager, already pulling bags from the trunk and heading inside. I followed him, unsure. I hadn't realized just how far out we'd come. There was no cell service, no other cabins in sight, just an isolated structure with a rusted mailbox at the end of a long dirt driveway. "Everything okay?" Jesse asked, noticing the look on my face. I nodded and forced a smile. It wasn't the kind of place I was used to, but that didn't mean anything bad was going to happen. Inside, the cabin had a rustic charm to it. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall. A large table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. It was cozy, but also eerily quiet, like it was waiting for something. We unpacked our bags, and after a while, I found myself sitting by the fire, trying to settle into the silence. Jesse had gone off to explore the area, and I was left alone with the crackling flames. I kept telling myself that this was exactly what I needed, a break from everything. Still, something about the place felt off, like the air was too still, the shadows too thick. Later that evening, after dinner, Jesse mentioned that he'd seen a trail just beyond the trees at the edge of the property. He was eager to explore it the next morning, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about the woods that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I sat there, the more I felt it. It was like the forest was watching us, waiting for something. But I didn't want to admit that to Jesse. He was already excited, and I didn't want to seem like a buzzkill. So we decided to turn in early. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear the occasional creak of the floorboards as I lay in bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling. The wind outside howled, and the trees seemed to sway unnaturally. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing noises, soft whispers that sounded like they were coming from the woods outside. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a loud thud. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze, straining to listen. There was another thud, followed by a scraping sound, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. I wasn't sure if I should go check on it or if it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, a deep thud, followed by a groan of wood. Something wasn't right. I pulled the covers tight around me and waited, every muscle in my body tense. The sound stopped. I don't know how long I waited before I finally got up, my legs shaky. I crept out of the bedroom, moving as quietly as possible, my hand on the banister of the stairs. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow from the fireplace. I moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, down the hall, past the kitchen, and toward the back door. It was ajar just slightly, as if someone had opened it and left it that way. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin. I stepped onto the porch, heart hammering. The woods were silent now, too silent. My breath formed clouds in the air as I stood there, trying to decide if I should venture further or just go back inside and lock the door. And then I saw it. In the distance, near the edge of the trees, a faint light flickered. It wasn't a flashlight or anything I could recognize, just a soft, glowing orb hovering about 6 feet off the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly ducked back into the cabin, shutting the door behind me. What the hell was that? I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just some kind of reflection or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me. But that didn't explain the noises, the scraping sounds, or the way the forest felt too alive, like it was moving, shifting around me. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely slept, tossing and turning in bed, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, Jesse was up and already packing his gear for the hike. He didn't seem at all concerned about the weird things I'd heard. In fact, he didn't even seem to notice how quiet everything was. The birds weren't singing, the wind wasn't blowing. It was as if the entire world had gone still. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jesse was excited, and I didn't want to ruin his day, so I agreed to go with him on the hike. But as we walked into the woods, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out the sun in some places. The trail was barely visible, and the farther we went, the quieter it became. After about an hour of walking, Jesse stopped at a clearing. "Let's take a break," he said, pulling out a water bottle. I sat down beside him, my eyes scanning the trees. Something in the distance caught my attention. Movement, something dark against the backdrop of the forest. I stood up quickly. "Did you see that?" Jesse looked at me, confused. "What?" "There's something out there," I said, pointing toward the trees. He squinted but didn't see anything. Probably just a deer or something, but I wasn't convinced. The air felt heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight. I wanted to leave, to go back to the cabin, but Jesse was already taking off down the trail again, urging me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to keep going. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, though it only grew stronger. We made our way deeper into the woods, the silence pressing in on me. Then, without warning, Jesse stopped in his tracks. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice low. I sniffed the air. There was something strange, something foul like rotting meat. My stomach turned, and I suddenly felt nauseous. Jesse looked around, his face scrunching up in confusion. "I don't know what that is," he muttered, but he didn't seem as alarmed as I felt. Suddenly, I heard it, a low growl, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder. I turned my head, trying to locate the source. My heart thudded in my chest as the growl turned into a snarl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the brush. Without thinking, I grabbed Jesse's arm. "We need to go. Now." We turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin, breathless and terrified. The rest of the weekend was a blur. We left early the next morning, never speaking about what happened in the woods. I didn't want to know what it was, and Jesse didn't ask any questions. We just wanted to get away, to leave that place behind. The drive back to the city was long, and the tension between us was palpable. We never talked about the strange noises, the light, or the growl. It was like we both had agreed to forget it. But as I drove away from the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching, waiting for the next time we'd come back. And that's when I realized the woods weren't just silent, they were patient. I never wanted to go to the cabin. It was my brother, Jason, who convinced me. He'd been up there before with some of his buddies from work, swore it was peaceful, out in the middle of nowhere, just the thing I needed. It was late September 2018. I'd been through a rough couple of months, laid off from my job at the steel plant, my girlfriend of 5 years deciding she needed to find herself, and my bank account looking worse every week. Jason thought getting out of town for a while, shutting off my phone, drinking a few beers by the lake, would help clear my head. I didn't believe him, but I was tired of sitting in my apartment, staring at the walls. So I went. The drive took longer than expected. The cabin was way up in northern Minnesota, deep in the woods, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. The last stretch was the worst. Just a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my truck, tree branches scraping against the sides like fingers trying to claw their way inside. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already setting. It was a small place, just one story, made of dark, weathered wood with a slanted metal roof. Jason had told me there'd be a generator, but when I got inside, I realized he had exaggerated about the modern conveniences. The place smelled like damp wood and dust. There was a single gas lamp hanging from a hook by the door, a wood-burning stove, and a cot in the corner. The windows were covered in grime, and the only furniture was a rickety wooden chair and a small table covered in scratches and old coffee stains. I wasn't planning on staying inside much anyway. I dumped my bag on the cot, grabbed a beer from the cooler, and stepped outside. The lake was just a short walk from the cabin, the water dark and still, reflecting the deep orange and purple of the sky. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No cars, no voices, not even birds. Just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. I stood by the water for a while, drinking my beer, watching the last of the light disappear. Then, just as I turned to head back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They weren't mine. These were older, pressed deep into the damp earth near the edge of the lake. Barefoot, they led from the water toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. My first thought was that they belonged to Jason or one of his friends from their last trip. Maybe they had gone for a swim and walked back without their shoes. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The prints were small, not like Jason's size 12 boots. They were fresh enough that a heavy rain would have washed them away, and Jason had been up here months ago. I don't know why, but a chill ran down my back. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe some local kids had found the place and wandered around. That seemed unlikely, given how deep in the woods it was, but I was too tired to think about it. I finished my beer, headed inside, and locked the door. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the stove, cracked open another beer, and read a book until my eyes got too heavy. The cot was stiff and smelled musty, but I was exhausted and fell asleep fast. It was around 3 in the morning when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers. The room was cold. I lay still, listening, feeling that uneasy silence pressing in again. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak of wood. It was coming from outside, near the porch. I held my breath, listening. Another creak, then another, like someone shifting their weight slowly on the old wooden steps. I reached for my flashlight, switched it on, and aimed it toward the door. The beam of light shook slightly in my hand. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. Raccoons? Maybe, or a deer brushing against the porch. I forced myself to relax, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to take a piss and stopped cold. There, in the dirt just outside the cabin, were more footprints. Barefoot, they started at the base of the steps and led toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting into knots. They hadn't been there the night before. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, that deep, instinctual warning that something wasn't right. But I wasn't about to let my own imagination scare me off. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear, stepping in such a way that it looked like a human print. That was possible, right? I spent the rest of the day fishing, trying to push the uneasy feeling out of my mind. But that night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of creaking wood. This time, it wasn't just on the porch. It was moving, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. My skin went ice cold. I sat up, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to call out, demand to know who was there, but my throat felt tight, like something was pressing against it, stopping the words from coming out. The footsteps stopped. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard something even worse. Breathing. Not mine. Not an animal. It was deep, slow, just outside the window. My mind raced. I wanted to grab my keys, run to my truck, and get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I threw my stuff into my bag, grabbed my keys, and practically ran to my truck. As I turned onto the dirt path, I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Not an animal. Not my imagination. Person. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the main road, then kept driving until I saw another car. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking so hard I could barely keep my foot on the brake. I never told Jason what happened. Never told anyone, really. Just said the place was too quiet, too isolated for me. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, about that breathing outside the window, and I wonder how many times, before I even realized it was there, it had been watching me. I never wanted to go to the cabin. It had been my brother's idea, actually, Darren, always looking for a new adventure. It was supposed to be some kind of bonding trip, just the two of us, a weekend away from the grind, out in the middle of nowhere. He found the place online, a secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It'll be peaceful, quiet, no distractions, he said. That was exactly the problem. I wasn't a fan of the idea from the start. A small, old cabin in the woods? No thanks. But Darren insisted. He said it'd be good for us, that I could leave all the stress behind for a couple of days. He knew how much I needed that, and despite my hesitation, I agreed. I think deep down I was just tired of fighting him, and I figured maybe it would be good to get away. The first few hours weren't so bad. The drive was long, winding through dense forest and narrow roads that barely had enough space for a single car, let alone the giant truck Darren drove. The air was fresh, with the scent of pine trees and damp earth filling the car every time I cracked the window. We talked a little bit during the drive, mostly about work and our childhood, things that didn't matter much but still helped pass the time. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over everything. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in on it from all sides. The place looked ancient, old wooden beams weathered and cracked. There was a stone chimney, and the roof had some patches where the shingles were coming loose. It looked more like something you'd see in a horror movie than a weekend retreat. I know it looks a little rough, but it's perfect, Darren said, looking pleased with himself. I wasn't so sure. The cabin had that eerie, unsettling vibe, even in the daylight. Something about it felt off, like it had been abandoned for years and was just waiting for someone to step inside. I didn't want to say anything to Darren, though. He was already excited about it, and I didn't want to kill the mood. Inside, the place was dusty, dark, and smelled like old wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and there was an odd feeling in the air, like something had been left undisturbed for a long time. The furniture was simple: an old leather couch, a coffee table with a chipped edge, and a few mismatched chairs. The kitchen was tiny, with just the basics: a stove, a refrigerator that looked like it belonged in a museum, and a cracked sink that was barely functional. We unpacked and set up for the night. Darren started a fire in the old stone fireplace, and I set up the sleeping bags in the small bedroom upstairs. It was the kind of place that would be cozy if you didn't think about the history it might carry with it. We spent the evening around the fire, talking and joking like we used to when we were kids. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and I could hear the occasional creak of the cabin as if it were shifting in the wind. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling kept growing. Something about this place didn't sit right. Later, after we'd eaten and cleaned up, Darren suggested we go for a walk around the property. I wasn't sure about it. It was getting late, and the forest looked dark and oppressive, but Darren was insistent. "Come on, it'll be fun. Just a quick walk to stretch our legs." I reluctantly agreed, and we grabbed a couple of flashlights from the cabin. The air was colder outside now, biting against my skin as we stepped into the woods. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing thick trees and dense underbrush that seemed to swallow the light as soon as it hit. We walked for about 20 minutes, the silence between us growing heavier with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an owl. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. But Darren was in a good mood, whistling and walking ahead of me, oblivious to my growing anxiety. Then we came to a clearing. It was odd, almost unnatural. The trees in this area were spaced unusually far apart, and the ground was covered in dry, brittle grass. The air here was still, no wind at all. There was an old stone well at the center of the clearing, half covered by weeds. The stones around it were weathered, cracked, and covered in moss. It didn't look like something you'd find on a regular hiking trail. It felt ancient, abandoned. As soon as we stepped into the clearing, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. "Look at this," Darren said, shining his flashlight on the well. "It's pretty cool, right?" I didn't respond at first. There was something about the well that made my skin crawl. I didn't want to admit it, but I had this feeling that something had happened here. Something bad. We stood there for a moment, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes just beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then it sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. They were too heavy to be a deer, and they weren't fast like a squirrel or rabbit. Someone or something was out there. I could feel my heart rate pick up. I turned to Darren, but he was still inspecting the well, completely unaware. I was about to say something when the footsteps stopped. I stood frozen, my eyes scanning the darkness, but I couldn't see anything through the thick trees. "Darren?" I whispered, but my voice felt like it was stuck in my throat. I didn't want to panic, but I could feel something in the pit of my stomach that told me we weren't alone out here. "Yeah." Darren finally turned around, his flashlight beam blinding me for a second. "I think we should go back to the cabin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. "What? It's just the woods, man. Nothing to be afraid of." But I couldn't shake the feeling. I started to back up toward the edge of the clearing, wanting to get as far from the well as possible. The footsteps started again. Only this time, they were closer, closer than before. "Darren," I said, more forcefully this time, "we need to go." He looked at me, confused. "What's your problem? You're acting like you saw a ghost." But I could tell from the look on his face that he wasn't completely sure either. Something in his eyes had changed, and for the first time, he wasn't as confident as he usually was. "Let's just go," I said, and I turned and started walking faster. We made our way back to the cabin in silence, the footsteps behind us fading into the night. When we reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, and Darren followed without a word. I double-locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. I didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, waiting. We sat in front of the fire, but neither of us spoke much. I kept hearing things, scratching at the window, the creak of the door, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. Eventually, we went to bed. Darren fell asleep almost immediately, but I stayed up, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to every sound around me. It felt like the walls were closing in. At around 3 in the morning, I heard something again. This time it was louder, scratching at the window, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I got up quietly, trying not to wake Darren. I tiptoed to the window and peeked through the curtains, my heart in my throat. There was nothing there, just the dark outline of the trees and the empty yard. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, too tall, and it stood perfectly still. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching. I pulled away from the window and backed up into the corner of the room, my hands shaking. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was that? I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I tried to find the number for the nearest sheriff. But before I could dial, I heard a knock at the door. One single knock. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was asking to come in. I didn't move. Couldn't. Darren stirred in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. The knock never came again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Darren acted like everything was fine. We ate breakfast, and when I brought up the strange things that happened, he brushed it off. Just your mind playing tricks on you. You've been stressed lately. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong, and I knew that I couldn't stay there another night. We packed up, left the cabin behind, and I didn't look back. I still don't know what happened out there, what I saw, but I'll never forget the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the trees, and I'll never go back to that cabin, not for all the peace and quiet in the world. It was a cool October evening when I first arrived at the cabin. My friends had insisted we go on a weekend getaway, and after weeks of hearing about it, I finally agreed. The cabin was an old, rustic place they had rented out for the weekend, situated about 2 hours north of the city. They had mentioned it was secluded, off the grid, and perfect for a little peace and quiet. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. First, it sounded great. But as soon as we drove up, something didn't feel quite right. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in on the narrow dirt road leading up to it. The place had a weathered, almost abandoned feel, like it had been left alone for too long. The wooden walls were faded and cracked, and the windows were framed with thick, dark vines that twisted like hands reaching for something. We unloaded our bags and went inside. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air, and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet made it feel like the cabin was groaning with age. The furniture was simple, old leather chairs, a wooden table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in who knows how long. The place looked like it could use some care, but we didn't mind. We were here to get away from it all, to escape the noise and stress of our daily lives. As the night wore on, we settled in. We made a fire in the fireplace, had some drinks, and shared stories. It was peaceful for the most part. The air was crisp outside, and the only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the trees. But then, around midnight, things started to feel off. I didn't notice it at first. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe I was just tired, but I kept hearing something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like scratching. It came from somewhere outside, just beyond the cabin, but it wasn't a usual noise. It wasn't the sound of animals. It was different, more deliberate. I ignored it at first, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal moving through the underbrush. But the longer I listened, the more it gnawed at my nerves. It wasn't until I stood up to get more firewood that I realized how still everything had become. The wind had died down, and the usual night sounds of the forest were gone. It was almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face, and looked around. The trees loomed in the darkness, their branches swaying ever so slightly, but there was nothing there. No animals, no movement, just the quiet of the night. I shrugged it off and returned inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing the scratching sound again and again, only it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from somewhere in the cabin. At first, it was faint, but the longer I lay there, the louder it seemed to get. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore it, telling myself I was just imagining things. But then I heard a loud bang from downstairs, like something heavy had fallen. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I found nothing downstairs, just an empty, cold living room and a flickering fireplace. But then, when I went back up to my room, I noticed something strange. The window was wide open. I had closed it earlier, or at least I thought I had. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer to the window. I peered out, but all I could see was the dark outline of the trees and the faint outline of the cabin's yard. Nothing unusual. The next morning, I brushed off my restless night, thinking I had imagined everything. It was just the isolation, the quiet, maybe a bit too much to drink. My friends were up early, cooking breakfast and chatting like nothing was wrong. But as I sat down to eat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed overnight. We decided to go for a hike in the woods. The cabin was surrounded by trails, and we figured it would be a good way to clear our heads. As we walked, the forest around us felt different. It wasn't just the stillness, but something else. The air felt thick, like it was holding something back. Every snap of a twig underfoot seemed louder than usual, and the trees felt like they were pressing in on us. It was like they were watching us. We made our way deeper into the forest, the trail becoming narrower as we went. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. I had this overwhelming feeling that we were being followed, though whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees, the dirt path, and the quiet. Eventually, we reached a clearing, a small meadow surrounded by dense trees. There was a strange, eerie stillness to it. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just an unsettling silence. That's when I noticed something strange in the middle of the clearing. It was a pile of rocks, arranged in a circle with something in the center. At first, I thought it was just a random collection of stones, but as I got closer, I realized it was something far more deliberate. The rocks had been carefully stacked, and in the center, there was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I stepped closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. The cloth was old, faded, and torn in places. As I unwrapped it, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Inside was an old, weathered doll. Its eyes were made of glass, cracked and dull, and its clothes were dirty and torn. It looked like something out of a nightmare. I dropped the doll in a panic, stepping back. I had no idea why, but I was terrified. My heart raced, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. My friends looked at me like I was crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I didn't want to stay in that clearing any longer. We quickly left the meadow and headed back to the cabin, but the strange feeling stayed with me. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. I couldn't stop thinking about the doll, about the strange silence in the woods, and about the feeling that we weren't alone. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was out there had been watching us. That night, things got worse. The scratching noise returned. It was louder now, unmistakable. It came from the walls of the cabin, from the floorboards beneath our feet. It was like something was trying to claw its way inside. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, maybe squirrels or raccoons, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was something else, something deliberate. I was about to call my friends into my room when I heard a knock on the front door. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. 3 knocks, then 4, then silence. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea who could be out there, especially since we were so far out in the woods, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I decided to look through the peephole. But when I did, there was nothing. No one at the door, just the empty, dark yard, the trees swaying in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, then locked the door and backed away. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, the scratching noise continuing, growing louder. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. In the morning, we packed up and left. The drive back to the city was quiet, everyone in their own thoughts. I don't know if anyone else felt the same unease I did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods hadn't just been quiet. They had been waiting for us to leave. We never spoke of it again, but I can't forget the feeling, the unease that lingered long after we left. That cabin, those woods, they had a presence, and I'm not sure we were supposed to be there. This is just the beginning of the story. If you like the direction it's going, I can continue and expand it further in multiple parts. It was late October when I drove up to the cabin. I was supposed to be there for 4 nights, a getaway I had planned for weeks. Just me, the quiet, and the trees. The place belonged to a guy named Tom, a friend of a friend, who said it was nothing fancy but had everything I needed. No Wi-Fi, spotty cell service, but it had a wood stove, a propane oven, and a generator for when I needed it. I was fine with that. I wanted space to think. A year ago, I had gone through a bad breakup, and lately, life had been nothing but work and sleep. This trip was supposed to reset my head, give me some quiet to clear things out. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town, up a narrow, winding road that turned into dirt after the first few miles. The last time Tom had been up there was last summer, but he said everything should be fine. The drive up was uneventful. Trees, silence, the occasional deer darting across the road. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but solid. 1 room, a tiny kitchen, a bed against the wall, a small table and a fireplace. A separate shed housed a generator and some tools. Behind the cabin, the trees stretched for miles. I settled in, unpacked my food, and lit the wood stove as the temperature started to drop. By the time it was dark, the wind had picked up, making the trees outside groan. I read a book by flashlight, ate a sandwich, then called it a night. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound outside. Something moving. I lay there, listening, my breath slow and controlled. Could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside the cabin. I stayed still, waiting. The footsteps stopped. I wanted to convince myself it was the wind or a branch falling, but deep down, I knew better. My phone had no signal, which I expected, but it felt different now, knowing I couldn't call anyone even if I wanted to. Eventually, after what felt like an hour of silence, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I walked outside to check around. The ground was damp from the night's rain, but there, in the soft mud, were footprints. Not deer tracks, not bear, human. Someone had walked around my cabin in the night. I told myself it could have been old prints, maybe even Tom's from the summer, but they looked fresh. I felt watched. I spent the day trying to shake it off, hiking a little, chopping wood, keeping my mind busy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep well. Every sound made me twitch. The wind howling, branches snapping, but nothing happened. The third day, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 30 yards from the cabin, in a patch of overgrown grass, I found a pile of cigarette butts. Someone had been standing there, watching. Recently, the butts were fresh, not washed away by the rain. I decided to leave the next morning. Maybe I was overreacting, but my gut told me I wasn't. I packed my things, made sure the generator was off, and was ready to go as soon as the sun was up. The problem was my truck wouldn't start. The battery was fine. I checked under the hood, and that's when I saw it. Wires had been cut. Not chewed through, not frayed. Cut. Someone had done this on purpose. I felt exposed, standing there. Whoever had been watching me had planned for this. I had no choice but to walk. The nearest road was miles away. I packed water, a flashlight, and a knife from the kitchen. I locked the cabin behind me, knowing it wouldn't do much good if someone really wanted to get in. I started walking. The forest was silent. Too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the damp ground. Every so often, I looked back. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. That creeping sense that someone was out there, just beyond my sight. 2 miles in, I found the first marker. A simple wooden stake in the ground, with a piece of red cloth tied around it. It looked old, weathered, but something about it felt off. Like it wasn't just a random marker, like it was meant for me. I kept walking faster now. The second marker was half a mile later. Another stake, another red cloth, but this one was newer, fresh. I didn't stop to think. I started running. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw a truck in the distance. A rusted-out pickup parked near an old service road. I didn't care who it belonged to. I sprinted toward it, waving my arms. The man inside rolled down his window, and I barely got the words out. I needed help. My truck was dead. I'd been stranded. He looked at me, then glanced toward the woods behind me, like he was expecting something to come out. Without a word, he unlocked the passenger door. We drove in silence until we reached town. I called the police, told them everything. They sent a deputy out to check the cabin, but by the time they got there, nothing was left. The footprints, the cigarette butts, even the stakes with the red cloth gone. No sign that anyone had been there but me. I never went back. I never found out who was watching me or why they wanted me stranded. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to make it out of those woods. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a break from the usual grind. The air felt heavier than it had in years, weighed down with the stress of city life, and I needed to get away. I'd always been the type of person to avoid crowds, so a cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I had no particular destination in mind, but a week away from it all seemed like exactly what I needed. I found the cabin online. It was one of those rustic places, tucked far away in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. The pictures were stunning, surrounded by trees, isolated, with an old stone fireplace that screamed cozy. It was the kind of place where I could finally disconnect. I could go hiking during the day and just sit with a book at night, no interruptions. I booked it immediately, not bothering to read the reviews. I didn't care about internet connectivity, and I didn't need to check for other people's opinions. It was quiet, peaceful, and that was all I wanted. When I pulled up to the cabin, I had the first impression that it was even more isolated than I expected. There were no neighbors for miles, and the trees surrounding the cabin were dense, like they were trying to swallow it whole. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, though the door was freshly painted, and the porch was well kept. Still, it had an old-world charm that I found strangely appealing. The wooden beams, the small garden at the front, everything looked out of place in such a remote area. I opened the door to the cabin, and it creaked on its hinges, just like I had imagined it would. The air inside was musty, a mix of wood, earth, and the faint smell of something else. A smell that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, but it made my skin crawl a little. I set my bags down and took a deep breath, admiring the space. It was small, with a large stone fireplace in the center of the living room. There was an old leather armchair beside it, the kind you might find in an antique shop, with a few blankets thrown over it. I liked the old, lived-in feel of it, like it had a history. The first thing I did was unpack my things. I didn't have much, just some clothes, a few books, and a camera to capture the surroundings. I wasn't planning on doing much exploring right away. It was already getting late, and I didn't want to wander too far from the cabin. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker. The silence around me was deep. It was the kind of silence you only get when you're far away from civilization, where even the wind seemed to move in slow motion. That night, the darkness outside seemed thicker than I expected. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It was as if something was watching me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The trees groaned in the wind, and an occasional bird call echoed in the distance. But there was nothing else. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just me and the quiet. I went to bed early that night, exhausted from the drive. The bed was old but comfortable, with a quilted cover that felt like something from my grandmother's house. As I lay in bed, I thought about how nice it was to be away from the stress of my usual life. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, the crackling of the fire still echoing in my mind. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something outside. It was faint at first, almost like a tapping. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The wind had picked up, and the trees were swaying, so I convinced myself it was just a branch hitting the side of the cabin. But then the sound grew louder, more distinct. like someone knocking on the door. I sat up in bed, heart racing. Who would be out here at this hour? The cabin was supposed to be isolated. I hadn't seen a soul on my way in, and the nearest town was miles away. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Typical. I cursed under my breath. Still, the knocking continued, rhythmic and persistent. I forced myself to stand up and walk to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but the knocking stopped just as I touched it. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the door, but no one was there. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. I stood there for a moment, convinced I had imagined it. There were no footprints in the dirt, no sign that anyone had been here. I chalked it up to my nerves, turned around, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to sleep, but the tapping sound lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to get out of the cabin and go for a walk. The sun was bright, and the birds were singing. It was a beautiful day, and the air was fresh, exactly what I needed to clear my mind. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, grabbed my camera, and set off into the woods. The trail was narrow, overgrown in some spots, but manageable. The trees towered above me, casting long shadows on the ground. I was alone, just as I had wanted. The woods were eerily quiet, though. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no distant calls of birds, just the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I wandered for a few hours, taking photos of the scenery, trying to capture the beauty of it all. But the longer I stayed out there, the more I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be standing just behind me. By late afternoon, I turned back toward the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees, small, almost imperceptible carvings in the bark. At first, I thought they were just scratches from an animal, but the more I looked, the more deliberate they seemed. Some were just lines, others were more intricate, like symbols or runes. I didn't recognize them, but I felt a shiver run down my spine as I passed one particularly deep cut that seemed to spiral around the trunk. When I made it back to the cabin, I was shaken. I hadn't seen anyone else out there, but the thought of those markings kept swirling in my mind. I made a quick dinner, ate in silence, and tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something odd. There was a scratching sound at the door again. It was faint, but it was there. I froze, listening intently. The wind had died down, and the silence was thick, almost oppressive. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But this time, I wasn't greeted by an empty porch. There, lying in the dirt just outside, was a small leather pouch. It was tied with a string, and when I bent down to pick it up, I felt a chill run through my fingers. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but the sensation was unsettling. I took the pouch inside, set it on the table, and sat down. The fire crackled in the background, but it did nothing to ease the tension in my chest. Inside the pouch were small, smooth stones, 4 of them, each a different color. There was also a folded piece of paper, so worn that I could barely make out the writing. It was in a language I didn't recognize, but the words felt wrong, as though reading them had a physical weight pressing on my chest. Couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I had no answers, no explanations, but I knew one thing for sure. Something wasn't right here. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I didn't care that I had paid for the entire week. I didn't care about the beauty of the place. I just needed to get out. The drive back felt endless, but every mile I put between myself and that cabin, the more I could breathe again. It felt like the air was clearing, like the pressure on my chest was lifting. As I passed the final turnoff to the cabin, I glanced back at the woods one last time. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything was there. But I knew better. Something had been watching me, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I wasn't going back to find out. By the time I made it back to the city, I was exhausted. The cabin had already become a memory, a strange chapter one would never revisit. The pouch stayed hidden in my bag for a while before I finally burned it. The stones turned to ash in the flames, and the paper turned to dust. I never returned to those woods, and I never will. I always wanted a quiet retreat, a place far from the noise of the city and away from the chaos of daily life. So when I found this cabin, tucked away in a secluded part of northern Michigan, I thought it was perfect. It was an older cabin, built in the late 80s, with a solid, worn-down charm. The real estate listing called it a rustic getaway, but I preferred to think of it as a peaceful sanctuary where I could escape from everything. It wasn't much, just a small cabin with a wood stove, a couple of beds, and a simple kitchen. There was a long dirt road that led up to the property, flanked by thick woods on either side. The nearest neighbor was a good 3 miles away, and I was looking forward to the solitude. I booked the cabin for a long weekend, planning to spend my time reading, hiking, and simply being alone. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, just before sunset. The drive up was long, the roads increasingly winding and narrow as I got closer. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull, gray day that made everything feel a little heavier. The cabin itself looked exactly as I remembered from the pictures online. Nothing fancy, but it had a certain rustic charm. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. I unpacked my things quickly, trying to settle in before it got dark. The inside of the cabin was just as simple as the outside. Wooden floors, old furniture, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy as I walked around, like there was something slightly off, but I chalked it up to the isolation and my overactive imagination. That evening, I made a simple dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, and then settled on the couch with a book. The silence in the cabin was almost too much, the kind of quiet that fills up every corner of the room. I wasn't used to it, but I tried to enjoy the peace. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The place didn't have electricity, but there were oil lamps that provided just enough light. The bed was old, the mattress a little too soft for my liking, but I was tired enough that I fell asleep quickly. At some point in the night, I woke up, feeling disoriented. The air was colder than usual, and I could hear the soft creaking of the wooden floorboards, as if someone, or something, was moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone. The nearest town was over an hour away. I told myself it was just the wind, the building settling, or some animal outside. But there was a strange pressure in the room, like something was waiting. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate creaking, followed by a soft shuffle. It wasn't an animal, I could tell. The sounds came from just outside my bedroom door, on the other side of the thin wood. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I thought I might be dreaming, or that it was just a trick of the wind, but the sounds grew louder, closer, and then there was a soft knock. Not on the door, but right on the wall next to it. I was paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound. My mind raced through every possible explanation, from an animal trying to get in to someone playing a cruel prank. But something told me it wasn't either of those things. The knock came again, this time louder. I sat up, my heart thudding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I couldn't make myself move. I just stared at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. And then it did. There was a low, scraping sound, like nails running along the wood. It didn't stop, kept going slowly, methodically, as if whatever it was had all the time in the world. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but there was no service. Of course, there wasn't. I had known that coming in. I had to get out of there. But the moment I thought that, the scraping stopped, and there was absolute silence again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, and then I heard it. A soft, whispered voice, just outside the door. It was barely audible, but it was there. The words didn't make sense. Just a jumble of noises, almost like an echo of something far away. I bolted upright, my feet hitting the floor with a thud. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I turned the knob slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the empty hallway. I shone the light down the narrow corridor, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No signs of anything that could explain the sounds I had heard. I turned the light off, heart still racing, and stepped back into the room. I thought I was going crazy, but the air in the room felt different now, thicker, colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I closed the door, locked it, and sat against it for a while, trying to breathe. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, and everything seemed so normal, so ordinary. But I knew something wasn't right. Something had happened the night before, and it wasn't just in my head. I spent the next few hours packing my things, but every time I moved past that door, I couldn't help but glance at it. The silence was oppressive, and the longer I stayed, the more I felt the weight of whatever it was that lingered in the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By noon, I decided I had enough. I couldn't stay in that place another night. I grabbed my keys and drove away, not looking back. When I got back home, I called the owner of the cabin to let them know I was leaving early. I didn't tell them about the sounds or the things I'd experienced. They would think I was crazy. But the owner was a local woman who had lived in the area for years. She seemed nice, and I didn't want to be rude, but when I told her I was leaving, she just sighed. "You're not the first to leave early," she said quietly. "There's something about that cabin, something that doesn't sit right with people. People feel it, but they can't explain it. But don't worry, it's not dangerous. You just weren't meant to stay." I didn't know how to respond. I hung up, still rattled, and I haven't been back to that cabin since. I never should have taken the trip. Looking back, every small sign was there, every little reason to stay home. But I ignored them, brushing off the gut feeling, telling myself I was just overthinking. I had always been the kind of person who prided myself on being rational, not the type to fall for superstition or let my nerves get the best of me. And that, in the end, was my mistake. It was the fall of 2018. I had just turned 34, working a dead-end job at a distribution warehouse in Minnesota. Life had become a cycle of long shifts, cheap takeout, and an empty apartment. When my old college friend, Aaron, reached out about a weekend trip to a secluded cabin in northern Wisconsin, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a break from the dull routine, a chance to breathe some fresh air, drink a few beers, and maybe even clear my head. Aaron had booked the place online. He told me it was remote, an old hunting cabin deep in the woods near some lake I had never heard of. That was part of the appeal, no cell service, no distractions, just nature and quiet. The listing had described it as rustic but comfortable. A wood stove for heat, a well for water, and a generator for electricity. That was fine by me. I had done plenty of camping in my younger days. A weekend without modern comforts didn't sound so bad. The drive up took longer than expected. I left work late on Friday, and by the time I got through the last small town and onto the dirt roads leading to the cabin, it was already dark. The roads twisted through dense pine forest, the headlights catching nothing but trees and more trees. I had downloaded a map of the area in case I lost service, but even then, I had to backtrack twice after taking wrong turns. I finally found the cabin just after 10 p.m. It sat at the end of a long, rutted path, hidden away among towering trees. It was smaller than I expected, just a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a single dim light above the door. Aaron's truck wasn't there yet. I got out, stretched my legs, and grabbed my bag from the passenger seat. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the deep, earthy smell of the woods. There was no wind, no sound except for the occasional creak of branches shifting overhead. I tried the door. It was unlocked, just like Aaron had said it would be. Inside, the place smelled of dust and old wood. The furniture was basic, A couch, a wooden table, a couple of mismatched chairs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and in the back, a single bedroom and a cramped bathroom. Aaron was supposed to arrive an hour after me, so I settled in, set up my sleeping bag on the couch, and cracked open a beer. I figured I'd stay up and wait, but by midnight, he still hadn't shown. I sent a text, but it didn't go through. No service, just as expected. I wasn't too worried. Maybe he'd stopped for gas or decided to take a detour. I gave up waiting and turned in for the night. I woke up sometime later, disoriented. The cabin was pitch black. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to embers, leaving the room cold. I lay there listening. Something had woken me up. At first, I thought it was just the silence, the kind of quiet that presses in on you when you're used to city noise. But then I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the cabin, but from outside, near the porch. A slow, deliberate sound. Not the random noises of nature, not the wind. I stayed still, my breath shallow, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, but heard nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a branch tapping against the cabin, maybe a raccoon or some other animal. I told myself I was being stupid, let out a shaky breath, and closed my eyes again. I woke up to daylight streaming through the small windows. Aaron's truck still wasn't outside. That was when the worry started to set in. I tried calling him, but of course there was no service. I figured I'd drive back toward town, find a spot where I could get a signal and check in. I stepped outside, stretching my arms, and that's when I saw it. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable in the damp dirt. Not animal tracks. Shoes. Someone had walked around the cabin during the night, stopping near the porch, right where I had heard the tapping. My stomach turned to ice. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The footprints led off into the woods, vanishing among the fallen leaves. I had a decision to make. Pack up and leave or stick around and wait for Aaron. I told myself it was probably just some local hunter who had wandered too close. Maybe even someone checking to see if the cabin was empty. It was unsettling, but not necessarily dangerous. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent most of the day near the cabin, gathering firewood, trying to keep busy. As the hours passed and Aaron still didn't show, I started to feel more uneasy. By late afternoon, I decided I'd give it one more night. If he wasn't here by morning, I'd head back. That night, I made sure the doors were locked. I kept the fire going, not wanting to wake up in the cold again. But the real reason was that I didn't want to wake up to silence. The fire crackling, the occasional pop of wood splitting, that was comfort. That was normal. At some point, I dozed off. Then I heard it again. The tapping. Slow. Deliberate. This time, I didn't freeze. I forced myself to move, to sit up, to reach for the flashlight next to me. My hands were shaking. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the window. Nothing. I stood, my breath shallow, and crept toward the door. I don't know what I was expecting, but when I yanked it open, the porch was empty. Just the same footprints in the dirt, only now they were fresh. Someone had been here right outside. And then I saw it. Something small, just beyond the porch steps. A piece of paper weighed down by a rock. I stepped out and picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting shaky but clear. "Leave now." That was all it said. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and was in my car in under a minute. I didn't care about Aaron, didn't care about the food I'd left behind. I drove as fast as I could down that winding dirt road, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. It was only when I was back on the highway, miles from the cabin, that my phone finally got a signal. Messages flooded in. The last one from Aaron chilled me to the bone. "Hey man, had to cancel. Hope you didn't go up there alone. That place gives me the creeps." had been a long, tiring year. Work, family issues, and a general sense of feeling overwhelmed had made it hard for me to get a solid break. So when I found a cabin for rent on a secluded lake about 2 hours away from the city, I thought it would be the perfect chance to unwind. I was a 32-year-old woman, no kids, and never one for hiking or camping, but this cabin was promising, rustic, remote, with just enough comfort to make it feel like a retreat, but not so luxurious that it felt out of place in nature. I thought I'd be able to disconnect and clear my head. The cabin sat on the edge of Lake Dellingham, a place I'd never heard of before, but it looked charming in the online listing. Surrounded by tall pines and nestled into the landscape, it seemed like it could be just what I needed. My friend Mia was supposed to come along. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend and needed space too. But at the last minute, she pulled out. She was going through some family stuff, and I understood. So it was just going to be me alone. It didn't really bother me. If anything, it felt like a blessing in disguise. I wasn't really a people person when it came to relaxing, and I figured I'd have the whole place to myself. I left early that Saturday morning. The sun was already high, and the drive was straightforward. The road out there was paved at first, then slowly became a 2-lane road that wound through forests and hills. There wasn't much else out there, just the occasional passing car or truck. A few small towns that looked like they had barely enough to keep going. The GPS led me without incident, and by the time the sun dipped lower, I was driving down a gravel road that bordered the lake. The cabin was nestled up on a hill, overlooking the water. It was isolated, yet inviting. The setting sun cast an orange glow across the lake, and I could already feel myself starting to relax. The cabin itself was old, really old. The kind of place that had probably been built decades ago but had been kept up well. It had a sloped roof with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and heavy, dark wood furniture that gave the whole place an earthy, homely feel. There was no TV, but a radio with a few stations came in clearly. The bathroom had a clawfoot tub, and the kitchen was small, but it had everything I'd need. I unpacked my car, grabbed some essentials from the small store down the road, and spent the evening lounging by the lake. There wasn't much sound aside from the occasional bird call or the wind stirring through the trees. The water was still, reflecting the pale moonlight in perfect symmetry. It felt peaceful, but then there was something about the place, something a little unsettling. I didn't want to admit it, but I started to notice things, small things, like the way the cabin creaked and groaned at night, or how the water would occasionally ripple without any breeze. But it wasn't anything that made me seriously uneasy. I just told myself I was being silly and let the quiet carry me into sleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke up the next morning, made some coffee, and went out to the porch to enjoy the view. The lake was still, the sky a perfect blue, and there was the faintest smell of pine in the air. It was beautiful, but that feeling of something being off lingered at the back of my mind. The second night, however, would change everything. The night was colder than I expected, and I had to throw on an extra blanket. It wasn't unusual, especially up here at this time of year, but the chill seemed to creep into the bones of the house. I went to bed early, exhausted from a long day of walking the woods and reading by the fire. I felt safe enough, but when I closed my eyes, something in the silence was unnerving. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise, a scraping sound. At first, I thought it might be the wind or maybe an animal outside, but then it came again, louder, more deliberate. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It wasn't a random sound. It was as though something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. It took me a second to realize I was alone in the cabin, and the noise was coming from the living room area just beyond the hallway. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and quickly dialed the number for the local sheriff's office. They told me no one had reported any strange activity in the area, and that wild animals, especially raccoons, could sometimes make noise like that. That didn't help much. I lay back down, telling myself it was just a wild animal or my imagination. I stared at the ceiling, but I couldn't get back to sleep. The silence that followed was oppressive. Then I heard the scraping again. This time it was closer. I could hear it more distinctly, as though something or someone was moving in the living room, right on the other side of the wall. My heart rate sped up, I was suddenly wide awake, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get up and check. But the logical part of me, if I could even call it that, told me it was nothing, just nerves. So I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself to relax. But the scraping continued, now accompanied by a soft thudding sound, as if something heavy was being dropped onto the floor repeatedly. I had to know what was going on. Slowly, I pushed the covers off and slipped my feet into my shoes. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a flashlight, and tiptoed to the door. The house was dark, and the cold air felt even colder outside the warmth of the blankets. My hands were shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make a sound. My feet were like lead as I moved down the hallway, and the scraping continued, louder now. I was nearly at the corner of the living room when I saw it. A figure, a silhouette in the dim moonlight coming through the window. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, standing next to the fireplace. It didn't move, but it was standing at an odd angle, as if it were listening too. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't an animal, not a raccoon or anything else. It was a person. But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I didn't think. I turned and ran back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were still shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, but her voice did nothing to ease the panic in my chest. I told her what I'd seen, and she said help would be on the way. I waited, watching the clock tick. Every creak in the cabin sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like something moving through the walls. I don't know how long I sat there, but by the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, an eternity later, the figure was gone. The cabin was silent once again. The deputy walked through the cabin, checking every corner. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. But when he checked the back door, he found a set of muddy footprints leading away from the cabin, heading straight into the woods. The deputy assured me it was probably someone who got lost or wandered too close. He said there were a few locals who had been known to sneak around the area at night, and with how isolated the cabin was, it wouldn't be unheard of for someone to get curious. I didn't feel reassured. I didn't feel safe, but I stayed the rest of the weekend anyway. The next day, the sun was out and the sky was clear. It was a perfect day. I spent the day walking along the lake, trying to clear my mind, but that feeling of unease never really left. I could still hear that scraping sound in my head, still see that figure standing there in the shadows. I left the cabin the next morning, early, not wanting to stay a minute longer than I had to. But the one thing that stayed with me was the sheriff's comment, that there were locals known to wander. It wasn't the figure that scared me the most. It was the fact that no one knew who they were or why they were so curious about my cabin. I never went back to Lake Dellingham, and I never rented a cabin alone again. I rented the cabin for a week. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a break from everything: work, people, city noise. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the river somewhere in the distance. The place was cheap, which should have been a red flag, but I didn't care. It was listed as secluded on the rental site, and that was exactly what I wanted. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch was a winding dirt road that seemed like it had been forgotten for years. Trees leaned over it, branches scraping against the car like fingers. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low. It was a small, single-story structure, dark wood, a porch with a couple of old chairs. Nothing fancy. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. A small fireplace, a tiny kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. I dropped my bag by the couch and checked my phone. No signal. That was fine. I expected that. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner on the old gas stove, read a book by lantern light when the single weak bulb in the cabin proved useless, and went to bed early. I slept fine, though I woke up at one point feeling like something had moved outside. But when I listened, there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. The next morning, I took a walk. There was a trail behind the cabin that led down toward the river. I I followed it, enjoying the quiet. The water was slow-moving, dark, with thick trees pressing in from both sides. Peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. The banks were muddy, and I saw old footprints. Someone had been here recently. They weren't mine. They were deeper, like whoever made them was heavier, and they led from the trees to the water's edge but didn't come back. I told myself they were probably just old, washed away by the rain or the river, but it stuck with me. That night, I woke up again. This time, I was sure I heard something. A crunch outside. Leaves or maybe gravel from the driveway. I sat up, listening. Nothing. I got up, moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The porch was empty. The trees stood still. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and went back to bed. The next day, I hiked a little farther. I found an old, rusted-out truck deeper in the woods, almost swallowed by trees. It had been there a long time. The doors were gone. The seats rotted away. The back of it was full of leaves and dirt. I checked inside, not sure what I was expecting. Maybe an old can or a piece of trash that could tell me how long it had been sitting there. But there was nothing, just decay. That uneasy feeling crept up again. Something about the truck being abandoned out here, miles from any road, didn't sit right. That night, I heard footsteps. I was sure this time. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Someone walking outside the cabin. I lay frozen, listening. The sound stopped near the porch. I waited, barely breathing. Then it moved again around the side of the cabin. My heart pounded. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind shifting the leaves. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Heavy, booted prints. They led from the tree line to the porch, then around the cabin to the back. No car tracks. No signs of a vehicle. Whoever had been out here had walked a long way. I stayed inside most of the day, keeping the doors locked. I thought about leaving, but it was a long drive back, and I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably a hunter or a hiker who had wandered too close. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned outside. Around midnight, I heard something new, a soft tapping. Took me a second to place it, fingertips on glass. My stomach dropped. I stayed completely still. The tapping continued, slow, rhythmic. I turned my head just enough to look at the window. I couldn't see anything, just darkness. The curtain was drawn, but a thin gap let in a sliver of moonlight. I couldn't tell if someone was out there. I wanted to move, to grab the flashlight, but I was afraid. If I moved, they'd know I was awake. The tapping stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything. Then, footsteps, moving away, slow at first, then faster. They faded into the trees. The first light, I packed my bag. I was done. Whatever was going on, I wasn't staying to find out. I threw my stuff in the car, started the engine, and drove. The road felt longer on the way back. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. My hands were tight on the wheel. When I finally got back to town, I stopped at a gas station. I needed a break, needed to calm down. As I pumped gas, I glanced at my car window. Smudges, fingertips, they hadn't been there before. The road to the cabin was rough, just dirt and gravel, winding through thick trees that blocked out most of the afternoon light. I had rented the place for a week, hoping for some peace. Work had been getting to me, and I thought being alone in the woods would help clear my head. The listing had promised secluded tranquility, and from the looks of it, that was exactly what I was getting. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built from thick logs, the kind that looked like they'd been there for decades. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a single wooden step led up to the door. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust. The furniture was simple, a couch, a couple of chairs, a table. The kitchen was small but functional, and the bedroom had just a bed and a dresser. That was fine. I wasn't here for luxury. The first couple of days were quiet. I spent time hiking around, listening to the wind in the trees, and reading by the fireplace. At night, it got eerily silent. No cars in the distance, no hum of city life, just crickets and the occasional rustling in the trees. I told myself it was just animals. I wasn't new to the woods. I'd been on plenty of camping trips as a kid, but there was something different about being alone. It made every little sound feel more important, like something was just outside, watching. On the third day, I noticed something strange. The food in the fridge had been moved. Not much, just a couple of things out of place. I told myself I must have done it without thinking. Maybe I was still half asleep when I grabbed breakfast that morning. I let it go. But that night, I heard something outside. A crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved quickly, darting between trees. This was something heavier, moving with caution. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, nothing. Just silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a branch fell, or maybe it was a deer. I forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the woods to my porch. They stopped at the window. I stood there, staring at them, my stomach twisting. Someone had been watching me. I felt exposed like a bug pinned under glass. I thought about leaving, but the cabin was miles from anything, and I didn't feel like spending the rest of the trip in a motel. I convinced myself it was a lost hiker who had wandered too close. Maybe they were just curious. That had to be it. That night, I locked every door and window. I left the light on in the living room and kept a kitchen knife within reach. I barely slept. The following morning, I found more footprints. This time, they led around the entire cabin. Someone had circled it. I packed my bags. I didn't care that I had paid for the full week. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded up my car, double-checked that I had everything, and got ready to leave. The engine wouldn't start. I turned the key again. Nothing. The battery was dead. My stomach dropped. I had left the headlights off, the doors shut. There was no reason for the battery to be dead. Then I saw it. The hood of the car was slightly open. I got out, slowly, my hands shaking. When I lifted the hood, I saw that the battery cables had been cut. I stepped back, my breathing ragged. Someone had done this. Someone wanted me stuck here. I grabbed my phone. No service. I hadn't checked before, why would I? But now, standing there with a useless car and no way to call for help, I felt completely trapped. I wasn't going to wait around to see who had done this. I threw on my backpack, took the knife from the kitchen, and started walking. The nearest town was about 10 miles away. If I kept a steady pace, I could make it before dark. The woods felt different now. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The path was narrow, winding, and the trees pressed in on either side, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Then a noise, footsteps, behind me. I turned fast, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing, just trees. I started walking faster. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't look back. I just ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. Then up ahead, I saw it. A small clearing, a dirt road. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. If I could get to the road, I could follow it to town. But just as I reached it, something moved in the trees to my left. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me. I gripped the knife, my hands slick with sweat. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran down the road, not stopping until I saw the first signs of town. Streetlights, a gas station. I stumbled inside, breathless, shaking. The clerk stared at me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but I wasn't. I wasn't okay at all. I called a tow truck, got my car fixed, and drove home. I never went back to that cabin, never tried to find out who that man was or what he wanted. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those footprints circling the cabin, about the footsteps in the woods, and I wonder how long he had been watching me before I ever noticed. I've never been one for the outdoors. Growing up in the city, surrounded by constant noise and chaos, I always preferred the comfort of home, the familiar hum of traffic, and the lights that never seemed to go out. But when Sarah, my girlfriend, suggested we take a weekend trip to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I reluctantly agreed. It sounded like a good way to get away from the stress of work and life in general. She had promised me it would be a peaceful retreat, just the two of us, a chance to disconnect. The cabin was located in the Appalachian Mountains, about 3 hours outside of Asheville, North Carolina. It was isolated, no neighbors for miles, just trees and wilderness. I should have known right then that it wasn't going to be as peaceful as she described. But I didn't argue. I wanted to make her happy. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The driveway was long and winding, a dirt path that seemed to disappear into the forest. The cabin itself was small, made of wood that had aged to a deep brown color, almost blending in with the trees. The porch creaked as we stepped onto it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was still, too still, like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I immediately felt uncomfortable. Inside, the cabin was just as you'd expect. Rustic, with an old stone fireplace, wooden beams across the ceiling, and a small kitchen tucked in the corner. There was a cozy living room with a couch that looked well-worn, a couple of armchairs, and a table where we would eat our meals. Nothing unusual, really, but there was an odd scent to the place, like it hadn't been lived in for a while, a mix of damp wood and something musty. Sarah was excited, exploring every inch of the cabin. She found a stack of old board games in a corner of the living room and started setting them up. "This is going to be so much fun," she said, smiling, but I couldn't shake that gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners of the room. I chalked it up to nerves, maybe because I wasn't used to being so far out in the middle of nowhere. We spent the evening relaxing, cooking dinner, and talking. It was nice to disconnect from our phones and computers for once, but the unease didn't leave me. As the night wore on, the cabin grew colder. Sarah started a fire in the fireplace, and we sat there, watching the flames dance. It should have been peaceful, but I felt restless. I couldn't explain it, but there was something wrong with this place. Later that night, after we'd gone to bed, things started to get strange. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something faint, scratching. It was so quiet at first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but it came again, a soft, almost rhythmic sound. I froze, straining my ears. It was coming from somewhere below us, near the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, but then it got louder. The scratching, followed by a soft thump. It sounded like something was moving beneath the cabin. My heart started to race, and I reached over to shake Sarah awake. She stirred but didn't open her eyes. "What's wrong?" she mumbled. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Something's under the cabin." She didn't seem to be as worried as I was. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," she said, her voice thick with sleep. I tried to convince myself she was right. It was probably just an animal, but the noise didn't stop. It continued all through the night, a persistent, scraping sound. By morning, I was exhausted, but Sarah was already up, making coffee. She was in good spirits, oblivious to the weird noises that had kept me awake. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing the dark circles under my eyes. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well," I lied. I didn't want to worry her. The next few days passed in a blur of hiking, cooking, and trying to relax. But every night, the scratching continued. It was worse on the second night, louder and more frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was causing it. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal. But when I ventured out into the cold night air to investigate, the world around me felt eerily silent. The forest seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing everything. I had a flashlight with me, and I used it to scan the area beneath the cabin. Nothing. No signs of an animal. No tracks in the dirt. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something odd. The ground near the edge of the cabin was disturbed, like something had been recently moved. The earth was loose, as if someone had dug there recently. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped closer, heart pounding. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it, like there was something I needed to find. I kneeled down, brushing away the dirt with my hands. That's when I saw it. A small, rusted metal latch, barely visible beneath the soil. It was old, and I almost didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. I tugged on the latch, and with a heavy creak, a wooden trapdoor slowly opened beneath me. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea what I was doing. What if this was some kind of old, forgotten cellar? But when I peered down into the darkness below, I could make out what appeared to be a narrow set of steps leading down. I hesitated. I had no reason to believe anything good would come from exploring it, but curiosity got the best of me. Slowly, I descended the steps, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air down there was musty and damp, and the walls were covered in moss. It was a small room, just a few feet wide, but the floor was littered with old, decaying furniture. Wooden chairs, a table, broken glass. It looked like an old storage area, but there was something off about it. A feeling of unease washed over me as I took in my surroundings. But it wasn't until I turned to leave that I saw it. On the far wall, a large, crude symbol was scratched into the wood. It looked like an eye, surrounded by strange, overlapping lines. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding. But there was no one there. The room was empty. I quickly scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I didn't tell Sarah about what I'd found. She wouldn't believe me, anyway. And honestly, I didn't want to scare her. But the scratching at night grew worse. It wasn't just under the cabin anymore. It felt like it was all around us, scratching at the windows, at the door. The last night we spent there was the worst. Sarah was sound asleep, but I was awake, my eyes darting around the dark cabin. The scratching was deafening now, like something was trying to claw its way in. And then there was a loud bang, like something had hit the door. I jumped out of bed, heart racing. I grabbed my phone and shined the flashlight across the room. That's when I saw it. A dark shape standing outside the window. I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at me with what I could only describe as cold, empty eyes. I don't know how long we stood there, but the moment seemed to last forever. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. I didn't wait for daylight. I woke Sarah up and told her we were leaving. We packed up quickly, barely taking the time to grab our things, and left before the sun even came up. We didn't say a word to each other on the drive back. We were both shaken, and I think we knew, deep down, that something had happened at that cabin that we couldn't explain. We never went back, and I don't think I'll ever feel at ease again, knowing that whatever it was that was in that cabin, whatever it was beneath it, was never really gone. Still out there, waiting just beyond the trees. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, the lake, and the silence. The kind of silence that felt like a relief after weeks of constant noise back home. The cabin was old, but sturdy, tucked deep into the woods on the edge of a lake. My uncle had built it back in the 70s, and since he passed, no one really used it anymore. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Exactly what I needed to clear my head. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, gold-tipped shadows across the gravel driveway. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. Inside, everything was just as I remembered it. The small kitchen with the ancient gas stove, the heavy wooden furniture, the single bedroom with the lumpy bed. I dropped my bag, cracked open a beer, and stepped onto the back porch. The lake stretched out in front of me, dark and smooth like glass. Not a single ripple, Not a single sound beyond the occasional rustling of leaves. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the wood stove, read for a while, then turned in early. The only sound I heard was the wind brushing against the cabin walls. No strange noises, no eerie feelings, just the quiet I came for. It was the next morning when things started feeling off. I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't actually rested. The air inside the cabin was stuffy, almost thick, like it hadn't moved all night. I opened a window, let the crisp air in, and went outside to stretch. That's when I noticed it. The woods felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees stood still, too still. Normally, the woods are full of small noises. Birds, squirrels, wind shifting through branches. But there was none of that. Just silence. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I spent the day fishing by the lake, hiking a bit, trying to shake the weird feeling. But it stuck with me. By the time the sun began to set, the unease had settled deep in my gut. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was alone. Nothing was out there. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not inside the cabin, but just outside, near the porch. Heavy, slow. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but deer are light on their feet. Whatever this was, it sounded deliberate, human. My chest tightened. I listened, holding my breath. Then nothing. No retreating footsteps, no movement, just silence again. I sat up, heart hammering. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was on edge from the quiet. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe I had dreamed it. I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Sleep came in restless waves. The next morning, I checked outside. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. The dirt near the porch was undisturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It made my skin crawl. Every time I turned, I expected to see someone standing in the trees, just out of sight. The third night, it got worse. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, even put a chair against the front door. I felt stupid, paranoid. But when night fell, the footsteps came back. Closer this time. Slow, measured steps moving around the cabin, circling it. I sat up in bed, gripping my pocket knife. The sound stopped. Then a long, slow scrape against the wall. Fingernails? A stick? I swallowed hard. My breathing was too loud in the silence. Then nothing. Hours passed, and the silence stretched unbearably long. Morning came, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I went outside, trying to find some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. And then I saw them. In the dirt, right beneath my bedroom window, footprints. Bare. Human. The prints were deep, clear. Someone had been standing there, watching. I packed my bag in minutes. I didn't care if it was a prank, if some local was messing with me. I wasn't staying another night. I threw everything into my truck, turned the key, and nothing. The engine wouldn't start. My stomach turned to ice. I tried again. Still nothing. I had no cell service. The nearest town was a few miles away, but I wasn't about to walk through those woods alone. I sat in the truck, gripping the steering wheel, trying to think. Then I saw it. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, something moved. A figure, tall, thin, just standing there, not moving, watching. I turned the key again, harder this time. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, spraying gravel as I tore out of there, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, hands shaking as I filled the tank. The clerk must have noticed how pale I looked because he asked if I was all right. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I never went back to that cabin. Not once. I told my family the place had bad memories, that I just didn't like it anymore. I never told them about the footprints, about the figure in the woods, about the way the silence in that place had felt unnatural. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that sometimes the quietest places aren't empty, and some silences mean you should run. I I don't think I'll ever go back to that place again. Not that I'd even be able to if I wanted to. I'm writing this because I need to get it all out before I try to move on. Not that I think I ever really can. It was late September when I went up to the cabin, a small place in the mountains of northern Montana. My uncle had left it to me in his will, and I'd put off checking it out for almost a year. I never really knew him. He was the kind of relative that only existed in old stories my dad used to tell. A recluse, someone who liked being alone. When he died, my dad didn't even act surprised. Just said something about how he probably died the way he wanted, quiet and alone. The drive up was long. The road got worse the further I went, turning from pavement to dirt, then to something that barely even looked like a road at all. I had to park my truck about half a mile from the cabin when the trees got too thick. The path leading to it was overgrown, like no one had walked it in a long time. When I finally saw the place, it was smaller than I'd expected. A simple one-room structure with a tiny porch and a slanted roof. It looked like it had been left to rot. The wood was dark with age, and the windows were so dirty I couldn't see inside. The key worked, but I had to shove the door with my shoulder to get it open. The inside was just as bad as the outside. Dust covered everything. There was an old cot in one corner, a wood stove in another, a table with a single chair, and a shelf lined with a few rusted cans of food. The smell inside was thick, like damp wood and something else, something stale. I spent the first hour just cleaning, sweeping out dust, clearing cobwebs. The air inside felt heavy, like it had been trapped for years. I opened the single window, but it barely helped. As I worked, I kept noticing little things. Scratches on the walls, a pile of nails in the corner, and a small wooden box on the table. It was locked, but it looked old, like something important might be inside. I ignored it. I wasn't here for some mystery. I just wanted to check the place out, see if it was even worth keeping. By the time night came, I'd done as much as I could. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, and the cabin was cast in long shadows. I locked the door and rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot, not trusting the old mattress. I was just about to lay down when I heard it, a crunching sound outside, like footsteps. I froze. Could have been an animal, but it didn't sound like one. It was slow, steady. I turned off my flashlight and sat in the dark, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, stopping at the front door. I held my breath. The handle rattled once, then again. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in, just testing it. I stayed completely still. The rattling stopped, and the footsteps moved away. I waited, heart pounding. After a few minutes, everything was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump. The trees creaking in the wind, the occasional rustling of leaves. My mind kept replaying the sound of the handle rattling. I told myself it had to be an animal, even though I knew better. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I made coffee on the old stove and forced myself to relax. The sun was out, making everything seem normal again. I stepped outside, stretching, trying to shake off the fear from the night before. That's when I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the trees to the door, then around the side of the cabin before disappearing back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. I told myself it was a hiker, someone passing through. But the nearest town was over 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car on the way up. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Stubbornness, maybe. The rest of the day was quiet. I chopped some wood, fixed the broken latch on the window, and tried to make the place feel less abandoned. I even pried open the little wooden box on the table. Inside was a single key, old and rusted, attached to a leather cord. No note, no clue what it was for, just the key. That night, I locked the door and propped a chair under the handle, just in case. I kept my hunting knife next to me as I lay down, staring at the ceiling. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was in the middle of nowhere. No one knew I was here. Then I heard it again. The same slow footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved to the window. A shadow passed across it. I stopped breathing. The shadow stayed there, unmoving. Then, after what felt like forever, it disappeared. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had my bag packed. I was done. I didn't care about the cabin or the key or my uncle's weird life. I stepped outside, gripping the handle of my knife. The footprints were there again, circling the cabin. But this time, there was something else. A single word, carved into the wood of the front door. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. The woods felt wrong, like the trees were pressing in. I reached my truck, threw my bag inside, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I never reported it, never told anyone. I don't know what I would even say. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just someone or something watching me, waiting. A week later, I got a call from my dad. He asked if I'd gone to the cabin yet. I told him no, that I didn't think I ever would. He didn't ask why. He just sighed, like he already knew, like he'd been expecting that answer all along. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The road twisted through dense trees, the kind that grew too close together, their branches stretching toward the road like fingers. It was late fall, and most of the leaves had dropped, leaving only skeletal limbs that swayed in the wind. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, just an endless stretch of road disappearing into the woods. My cell service had cut out a while back, leaving me alone with the hum of my tires on cracked pavement. I had rented the cabin for a long weekend, just me, away from everything. Work had been stressful, life had been exhausting, and I needed time to breathe. The listing described it as secluded with no neighbors for miles. That had sounded perfect when I booked it, but now, as I pulled onto the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin, it felt a little too secluded. The place was exactly as it had looked in the photos. A small, one-story structure with a wraparound porch and a pitched roof. The paint was faded, but it looked sturdy. The front door had a single, dusty window, and two small windows flanked it on either side. A fire pit sat in the clearing out front, surrounded by logs for seating. Beyond that, nothing but trees. I turned off the car, and the sudden silence was unsettling. No hum of an engine, no background noise, just the wind rustling through the trees. I grabbed my bag and stepped out, the leaves crunching under my boots. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I took the keys from my pocket and walked up to the door, unlocking it with a slight struggle. The door stuck for a second before it gave way, groaning as it swung open. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living area with an old couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a bedroom in the back. The walls were lined with old wooden panels, and the floors creaked under my weight. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. I walked through each room, flipping light switches. The electricity worked, at least. The water, too, though the pipes groaned when I tested the sink. I set my bag down in the bedroom and sat on the bed. The mattress was firm, the sheets clean but worn. There was a single window above the bed, and through it, I could see the woods stretching out in all directions. No neighbors, no roads, just trees. That first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat outside for a while, listening to the quiet. It was colder than I expected, and the wind picked up as the night went on, making the trees sway. The only sound was the occasional rustling of branches or the distant call of some animal. I told myself I would enjoy the solitude, that this was what I needed, but something about the place felt off. I woke up in the middle of the night, not to a sound, not to a nightmare, just awake, staring at the ceiling. The air inside the cabin felt still, too still. I reached for my phone out of habit, but there was no service, no messages, nothing. I lay there listening. The wind had died down, and the night was completely silent. That was the part that got to me. In a place like this, the woods should be alive with noise, crickets, owls, something. But there was nothing. The next morning, I went outside to get firewood from the small pile stacked near the porch. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't from any animal either. bare human footprints leading from the woods to the front of the cabin. I stood there for a long time, staring. The prints were fresh, slightly smudged at the edges from where the wind had brushed over them. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The trees stood still, their bare branches motionless in the crisp morning air. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had been out here before me. Maybe the prints were older than they looked. But that didn't explain why they led toward the cabin, and not away. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling that someone had been, or still was, out there. I explored the area a bit, staying close to the cabin, but found nothing. No more footprints, no sign of anyone passing through. The woods felt empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. I kept the fire going, letting the warmth push back the creeping unease that had settled in my chest. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. At some point in the night, I woke up again. This time, there was a sound, a faint tapping, barely audible over the crackling fire. I held my breath, straining to listen. Came again, a light, deliberate tap against the glass. The window above the bed. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. Another tap, then silence. I turned my head, slowly, toward the window. Nothing was there, just darkness beyond the glass. I waited, muscles tensed, expecting to see something move, but there was nothing, just my own reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake until the sky started to lighten, until I felt brave enough to move. When I finally got up, I checked the window. The glass was smudged, like someone had pressed their hand against it. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside, my heart hammering in my chest. I expected to see someone, something standing in the clearing, watching, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the trees and the quiet. The footprints from yesterday were gone, erased by the night wind. But as I turned toward my car, I noticed something else. New prints, fresh ones, leading from the porch steps into the woods. I didn't stop to think. I got in the car, turned the key, and backed out so fast the tires spun on the dirt. I didn't look back, didn't check the mirror. I just drove, pushing the car faster and faster until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. I wasn't alone. And I never should have gone to that cabin.